What if absolute power didn't just corrupt the soul but curdled the body? These weren't peasants or prisoners. They were kings, queens, emperors, soaked in silks, dripping with jewels, and absolutely feral under the velvet. Welcome to the side of royalty you were never meant to smell. From goat-scented lovers to pus-soaked tyrants, these 30 royals reigned in stench and scandal. You can polish a crown, but not a corpse. This is 30 royals with shockingly bad hygiene. History's filthiest power trip begins now. Before we dive nose first into the royal rot, take a second to subscribe unless you're already committed to going down with the stink ship. And hey, while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? And what ungodly hour is it right now? Because let's be honest, this is not daytime content. James VI and I, Scotland, England, 1566, 1625. If power corrupts, then perhaps unchecked power ferments. And in the case of James VI of Scotland, later James I of England, it fermented into a very specific stench. Not the metaphorical rot of monarchy, though he certainly had that too. No, James was reportedly the kind of royal whose presence arrived 5 seconds before he did on the wind. It wasn't a secret at court. In fact, it was practically a scandal. Courtiers, who were usually trained to smile through syphilis and bow through botched beheadings, drew the line at the king's personal hygiene. One man noted politely, of course, because this was still a job interview with divine right, that the king was not the cleanliest. Another was less subtle. He smelled strong, not strong as in masculine. Strong as in mildew left to bloom. The problem wasn't poverty or even ignorance. James wasn't some backwoods baron without plumbing. He was the king of 2 entire kingdoms. But water, to him, was not a friend. It was something you feared. Doctors at the time still believed bathing opened the pores to disease, so James, ever the cautious intellectual, avoided it. Thoroughly, repeatedly, with conviction. He reportedly bathed so rarely that some sources joked he might disintegrate if he ever actually submerged. He also liked his clothes, really liked them, so much that he wore the same ones until they gave up. His outer garments were often visibly soiled, stained not just with the detritus of royal duties, but with the slow accumulation of a man who did not believe in change or soap. His fingernails were long and filthy, his beard greasy, and his hair, well, the less said the better. Imagine a scarecrow with absolute power and a theological treatise under one arm. Even his friends noticed. Sir Anthony Weldon, who initially supported the king, later wrote of his nasty habits, including letting his fingers fester under layers of grime. Imagine being knighted by a hand like that. A moment of eternal glory tarnished forever by a very literal smear. And yet, James styled himself a philosopher king. He wrote treatises on kingship, on witchcraft, even on smoking. He hated it hilariously. But not once did he pen a defense of cleanliness. He simply didn't see the point. His mind soared through metaphysics and foreign policy. His body remained glued to the same pair of stockings. Some might call it pragmatic, others would call it pungent. But perhaps the most telling detail wasn't even about James himself. It was about the air he left behind. Rooms he occupied needed time to recover. Fabrics were perfumed, candles lit. Attendants discreetly opened windows, even in the cold. Yet he continued to preach divine right with the unshakable confidence of a man who believed he was clean enough for God. Of course, being clean enough for God doesn't mean being clean enough for your courtiers, or history, or your own skin. But no matter. James didn't just unite 2 crowns, he united body odor with political authority, and for a time, that was enough. Which begs the question, If this is the man who gave us the King James Bible, how much of it was edited by someone holding their breath? And yet, even James pales in comparison to a man who once warned his mistress before visiting her, a king so gloriously indifferent to scent that he turned his own body into a punchline and still got the girl. Let's talk about Henry IV of France. Henry IV of France, 1553-1610. There are many ways for a man to declare his love: poetry, flowers, a war fought in her name. Or, in the case of Henry IV of France, a well-penned note saying, in essence, "Brace yourself, I stink like a goat." Romance, truly, was different back then. And hygiene? That was a negotiation between your body and your pride, and Henry's pride always won. This was not some scandal whispered behind tapestries. Henry knew. Everyone knew. In fact, it became part of his legend. The first Bourbon king of France, the dashing warrior king who ended decades of religious war, a pragmatist who converted to Catholicism because Paris is well worth a mass. He was also the man whose very scent preceded his politics. The infamous letter, written to his mistress Gabrielle d'Estéré, was not an outlier. It was a confession, but not a repentant one. "I am on my way," he wrote, "and I stink like a goat." No euphemism, no shame. Just a rugged, lived-in aroma of battlefield, horse sweat, and underwashed linen. One imagines Gabrielle reading it with a sigh, not of anticipation, but of acceptance. This was, after all, the most powerful man in France, and apparently the most aromatic. Henry had spent his early years not in a Parisian palace, but in the rugged Pyrenees, raised on austere Protestant values and outdoor living. Cleanliness was not a sacrament in that world. By the time he reached the royal court, he was already years behind in the aristocratic arts of rosewater and scented gloves. And once in power, he never quite caught up. Why would he? His odor did not impede his military victories, his political maneuvering, or his bedroom conquests. It was, if anything, part of his rugged charm, a musk of authenticity in a world of perfumed pretense. But charm has limits, especially when the smell refuses to stay charming. Henry's habits, or lack thereof, were widely remarked upon. He often wore the same shirt for days, sometimes weeks, and resisted changes in attire unless illness or formal diplomacy absolutely demanded it. His courtiers would murmur about the stale mix of body sweat, horse saddle, and campfire that clung to him like a second skin. Baths were viewed with suspicion, even fear. Many still believed they let disease in through the pores, and Henry was no exception. He preferred a dry wash, a splash of cologne, a change of ruff, maybe, and forward he charged. Still, the stench was hard to ignore. At formal audiences, foreign ambassadors reportedly kept their distance. Servants flinched when called too close. His chambers, once vacated, required perfuming and heavy ventilation. And yet, this same man inspired deep loyalty. He was generous, charismatic, and utterly human in a way few monarchs dared to be. He joked with peasants, wept with nobles, and smelled relentlessly with both. Gabrielle d'Estéré wasn't the only one who tolerated his natural perfume. He fathered at least a dozen children, legitimate and otherwise, and maintained a bustling rotation of mistresses, each of whom, presumably, had to come to terms with the rustic reality of Henry's personal scent profile. Either that, or the standards of the day were lower, much lower. It's possible that in the Renaissance nose economy, everyone was too overwhelmed by incense, chamber pots, and disease to be overly sensitive to goatish nuances. Still, there's a moral contradiction at work here. Henry IV, the man who unified France after a civil war, restored economic stability, and was considered one of the most beloved monarchs in French history, couldn't be bothered to wash his armpits. He brokered religious peace, but not a truce with his laundry. And maybe that's why people loved him. Henry didn't pretend to be clean. He didn't perfume over his flaws. He governed with open hands, an open heart, and open pores. If Louis XIV would later perfect the theatre of monarchy with mirrors and perfumes, Henry was the rehearsal sweaty, under-rehearsed, and somehow still magnetic. But if Henry's goat-scented charm was half endearing, half endurable, the next royal takes it into something darker, something depressive, operatic, and steeped in layers of filth that no mistress ever kissed away. Enter Philip V of Spain, and the castrato who sang him into washing. Philip V of Spain, 1683–1746. There are kinds of filth born from arrogance, from laziness, from that peculiar royal delusion that the body is exempt from the needs of the flesh. But Philip V of Spain was different. His stench wasn't a statement, it was a symptom. A monarch whose grime came not from pride, but from despair, a man so profoundly broken that even soap felt futile. Philip inherited a throne and a mental illness in nearly equal measure. The first Bourbon king of Spain, thrust onto the Spanish throne by the will of Louis XIV and the chaos of European succession, he had the divine right of kings and none of the stability to bear it. His reign was not so much a rule as it was a long, public unravelling. At court, his hygiene, or lack thereof, became a spectacle in itself. There were days, sometimes weeks, when Philip refused to change his clothes. Not because he enjoyed the scent of his own musk like some rugged warlord, but because he couldn't summon the energy to lift a sleeve. He lay in bed for days on end, speaking to no one, his face unshaven, his linen soiled and unchanged. He smelled of stillness of unwashed flesh, spoiled food, and the slow decay of unchecked melancholy. It wasn't always this way. Philip began with promise. Young, strong-jawed, married to a vivacious princess, armed with Bourbon ambition. But as the years dragged on, depression hollowed him out. He began to believe that he was damned, that he was dying, that he already had died. He would repeat the same phrases to attendants for hours, muttering about his impending death even as he stubbornly continued to breathe. And what, after all, is hygiene to a man who thinks he's already dead? His doctors despaired, ministers wept. His wife, Elizabeth Farnese, manoeuvred to maintain the appearance of a functioning court, but within the walls of the royal chambers, the truth stank. Quite literally. Servants whispered of the smell, a smell that clung to the air around the royal bedchamber, a pungent mix of neglect and sweat and skin never scrubbed. In his worst spirals, Philip refused to be touched, dressed, or even looked at. He wouldn't allow haircuts, shaves, or cleaning. The royal barbers and valets were left standing outside the door, waiting for an invitation that never came. The king's fingernails grew long and dark. His beard knotted into his collar. Food crusted on his garments. The fabric began to rot. His voice went silent, but his body screamed of suffering. And then came Farinelli, the castrato singer imported from Italy, paid handsomely, and handed the strangest royal assignment in European history, was not brought to entertain the court, but to coax the king out of his despair. And incredibly, it worked. Farinelli sang each night soft hypnotic arias that seemed to lift the weight from Philip's chest. He would hum along, sit up, smile. On better nights, he'd rise. On miraculous ones, he'd bathe. It was never a cure, just a reprieve. But for those nights, Spain had its king back. A cleaner king, at least. One who shaved, one who changed his clothes. One who smelled like a man and not a crypt. The irony, of course, was that Spain, riddled with political instability, famine, and colonial unrest, was technically being ruled by a castrato lullaby. But when the alternative was a monarch marinating in his own madness, no one complained. Philip eventually abdicated, only to return to the throne again, like a ghost who had unfinished business and unfinished laundry. His hygiene never fully recovered. How could it? Depression doesn't leave so easily, and neither does the scent of a soul rotting from within. But his story leaves us with a queasy truth. Sometimes a king doesn't need armor, or wisdom, or might. Sometimes he just needs a song to remember he's alive. And sometimes, when even a song won't do, when the body decays but the power endures, what you get is a monarch so perfumed in denial that even his teeth couldn't outrun the rot. Let's talk about Louis XIV, the Sun King, with a smile that cleared the room. Louis XIV of France, 1638-1715. It is one thing to rule a kingdom, it is another thing entirely to perform one. And Louis XIV didn't just rule France, he choreographed it. Every step, gesture, and breath of his court life at Versailles was orchestrated like an eternal opera, with him as both lead actor and divine object of worship. The Sun King, Le Roi Soleil. He called himself that, and everyone else had to pretend the light was warm, even when the smell said otherwise. You wouldn't think the centre of European elegance could be pungent. But behind the mirrors, silk, and powdered wigs, there was a man whose hygiene routine could be summed up in 3 words. Don't get wet. Doctors at the time warned Louis that bathing was dangerous, that water could disrupt the humours, weaken the body, and open the skin to disease. And Louis, ever the devoted hypochondriac, listened. He bathed roughly twice in his entire life. Both occasions ended in panic. So instead of washing, he perfumed. Mountains of it, floral oils, musk tinctures, cologne in cascading waves. Versailles didn't sparkle, it reeked of olfactory warfare. Smell became a royal weapon, a sensory illusion meant to mask the increasingly unignorable truth that beneath the velvet, the king was rotting. And not just metaphorically. Louis XIV had a dental history that read like a battlefield report. A disastrous operation to remove an abscessed tooth went so wrong that it tore a hole into his palate. The result? Every time he spoke or ate, air passed through his mouth into his nasal cavity, creating a breath so foul that even his sycophantic courtiers struggled to stay in the room. His meals were often cut short not by etiquette, but by disgust. He suffered for decades. His gums receded, his teeth blackened, and his remaining molars were said to be loose, stained, and painful. Yet, in court rituals, he had to smile, to speak, to give audiences while his mouth quietly broadcast what no herald ever would: decay. Imagine being kissed by the sun only to find it reeks of rotting meat and cloves. Yet no one could say it aloud. This was the man who made nobles compete for the privilege of handing him his socks, who staged his own waking as a royal event, who placed his bedroom at the physical centre of Versailles so that every hallway, every corridor, every courtier revolved around his presence. To suggest that the monarch, the literal sun around which all power orbited, smelled like a dental graveyard would have been treasonous, so they perfumed harder. He dressed in layers, lace, brocade, powdered wigs the size of cloud formations. Underneath it all, his skin was largely untouched by water. Instead, servants wiped him down with dry cloths and dabbed perfumed alcohol onto his body, like trying to disinfect a corpse with cologne. The daily ceremony of the king's toilette, attended by nobles desperate for influence, was little more than a ritualized denial of reality. The man was put together like a monument, but smelled like a warning. And Versailles itself, followed suit. Despite the manicured gardens and gilded galleries, the palace lacked functional plumbing for much of Louis's reign. Courtiers urinated behind curtains. Hallways reeked of chamber pots and overused perfume. The entire court became a theatre of denial, immaculate in image, unbearable in scent. Louis governed through spectacle. He knew that power wasn't just held, it was performed, displayed, inhaled, and so he doubled down. Even as his body failed him, even as infections and dental rot and chronic ulcers gnawed at him, he dressed up, he shone, he sprayed. Because to admit the smell was to admit the truth, that the divine king was just a man, rotting slowly in silk. And yet, perhaps no one understood this contradiction better than the next queen on our list. A woman who ruled alone, wielded terror like a dagger, and whose smile, according to her courtiers, carried a scent strong enough to make ambassadors wince. Welcome to the sugar-rotted reign of Elizabeth I. Elizabeth I of England, 1533–1603. She was Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the red-haired sun that ruled over England's golden age. Her speeches rallied troops, her court shimmered with Renaissance flair, and her portraits painted the image of imperious perfection. Alabaster skin, pearl-studded gowns, and an expression of serene command. But get close, too close, and the illusion cracked. Because Elizabeth Tudor, for all her polish and poise, was, in the nasal sense, extremely hard to be around. Let's start with the teeth. Elizabeth loved sugar, obsessed over it, in fact, imported, expensive, alchemically magical sugar. She ate candied violets, rose petal preserves, almond sweets, and marzipan confections shaped like animals, castles, even churches. One courtier joked that her table looked more like a jeweler's window than a dinner plate. The result? Her teeth darkened, then blackened, then rotted. It's said that by the end of her life, she barely had any left. The state of her mouth wasn't just a private affliction, it was an olfactory experience. Foreign ambassadors recorded that speaking to the Queen was sometimes difficult, and not because of language. Diplomats from as far as Venice and Spain quietly commented on her breath phrases like, "not pleasant at close quarters," or more bluntly, "a stench of the mouth." Even her closest advisers made quiet jokes about it. Elizabeth herself, never one to miss a beat, reportedly quipped that she bathed once a month, whether I need it or not. Humor as deodorant. But it wasn't just the teeth. The fear was deeper. Elizabeth had a pathological dread of medical intervention. She loathed doctors, detested bloodletting, and was utterly horrified by the idea of tooth extractions. So even when her gums abscessed, or when a molar turned black and wobbly, she would rather grimace through the pain than allow anyone near her with a tool. Pain and rot became part of her daily existence, hidden under powder and pearls, masked with clove oil and rose water, and silenced with political cunning. Her courtiers, trained to read her mood like scripture, learned to stand at a certain angle, to breathe through their mouths, to avoid leaning in when she spoke. Her overall hygiene? Better than some, but far from modern fantasy. Elizabeth's signature white face paint ceruse, a deadly blend of vinegar and lead, accumulated daily on her skin. It wasn't gently washed away at night. It was caked on, layered, and reapplied. Over time, it seeped into her pores, damaging her skin, leaving lesions, scars, and a chalky odour that no perfume could quite disguise. The longer she ruled, the thicker the mask became. Privately, her ladies-in-waiting confessed that beneath the regalia, Elizabeth's linens were rarely fresh. Her undergarments, sweat-soaked and sugar-dusted, were infrequently changed. She did not enjoy bathing and avoided it for long stretches. Scented gloves and pomanders became her daily shield against the stench of others and, perhaps, herself. But here's the thing. It worked. The grime, the rot, the unwashed silk, it was all part of the theatre. Elizabeth weaponized her image so completely that even her breath couldn't betray her. She transformed herself into a myth, a walking emblem of empire, who didn't need to be clean. She only needed to be seen, and feared, and worshipped. And if a few courtiers fainted in the process, all the better. Let them think it was awe. Her death, when it came, was drawn out and silent. She refused medical attention, resisted rest, and declined to lie down. For days she stood or sat in full regalia, layered in paint, pearls, and powder, as if willing her body to stay on stage a moment longer. She died as she lived, withholding, mythologized, and probably smelling of lavender-soaked lace over something less divine. And yet, Elizabeth's decay was elegant next to what came after her royalty, who didn't just neglect hygiene, but seemed to loathe it. The next monarch was her descendant in title, but in scent? A different species entirely. Meet George IV, a man whose wardrobe sparkled, but whose breath could kill. George IV of Britain, 1762–1830. If Elizabeth I hid decay behind pearls and power, George IV hid his behind rhinestones, corsets, and a level of vanity so grand it could have dressed a fleet. This was a man who thought of himself as England's Apollo divine, adorned and utterly irresistible. He dressed like a chandelier with gout, spent money like the national debt was a fashion statement, and posed for portraits that required more retouching than his soul ever got. But peel back the velvet and examine the seams literally, and George begins to stink. Not just metaphorically. His body was a trap of sweat, starch, and spoiled indulgence. The sort of rot that starts subtly faint at first, like damp wallpaper, but gathers force in small, sour waves until everyone in the room is silently regretting their birth. He began life as a handsome young prince, vain, certainly, but clean enough to be considered dashing. But vanity ages like cream. As the years dragged on, George swelled in body and collapsed in effort. By the time he was crowned king in 1820, he was a walking contradiction, obsessed with appearance, yet personally foul, surrounded by luxury, yet marinating in his own juices. His clothing told the first part of the story. George was fanatical about fashion. Tailors received furious letters about the width of his collars. He ordered boots he couldn't physically wear. His closets were stuffed with more coats than he had days to wear them. Yet his underclothes, those closer to the skin, told a less glittering tale. Valets often found that his shirts, once removed, reeked of stale sweat. The inside linings of his formal coats were sometimes crusted with old body oils. He would wear garments repeatedly without washing, layering perfume over decay until the scent resembled floral compost. The real horror, though, was the breath. George's teeth were a public scandal. Decades of sugared wines, candies, and meat-heavy feasts had left them yellowed, then blackened, then gone. By the time he reached his final decade, only a few decaying stumps remained. They wobbled, they stank, and they bled when he tried to chew. His gums were a swollen battlefield of abscesses and infected pockets. He chewed slowly, with long pauses for pain. Servants reportedly gagged quietly when summoned too close. And yet he smiled, constantly. A grotesque parody of charm. Courtiers would do their best not to recoil. Ambassadors braced themselves for audiences with the king the way sailors brace for storms, noses clenched, expressions fixed in noble resignation. It would have been one thing if George had admitted to his failings, but no, he doubled down. Perfume was sprayed on his person by the pint. His bed linens, reportedly rarely changed, were doused in cologne to keep the stench manageable. Even the royal toilet, more ornate than practical, was sprayed with rosewater in a doomed attempt to keep up with the man who used it. By the end of his life, George was obese, lethargic, and riddled with ailments. His body was a medical collage. Gout, dropsy, respiratory distress, constipation so severe it caused vomiting. He refused most treatments, partly out of pride, partly out of terror. At one point, it was said he could not bend to tie his shoes, so he wore slippers to state occasions and dared anyone to mention it. What's remarkable isn't just how filthy he became, but how hard he worked to pretend he wasn't poor. He remained fixated on appearances until the end, surrounding himself with mirrors, oils, and powders, trying to maintain the fantasy that he was still beautiful, still adored. It was a tragic kind of delusion. The king, who could no longer stand unaided still, expected his portraits to depict a waistline he hadn't seen in 2 decades. And while George may have drowned his sins in brandy and bergamot, his queen did not. She was filthier, louder, and far less inclined to pretend. Caroline of Brunswick, the wife who reeked of rebellion and livestock. Caroline of Brunswick, Princess of Wales, Queen Consort, 1768, 1821. If George IV was a tragic opera in silk slippers and gout, then Caroline of Brunswick was the barnyard parody that followed mud-caked boots stomping down the marble halls of Windsor, trailing the scent of scandal, and something unmistakably mammalian. Where George tried to drown his rot in perfume and denial, Caroline didn't bother. Her filth was not accidental. It was defiant. This was a woman who understood court expectations and took a perverse pleasure in spitting in their perfumed face. Caroline, Princess of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel, arrived in England in 1795 to marry George, and the disaster began before she even unpacked. George reportedly took one look at her and called for brandy. She found him drunk, bloated, and preposterously overdressed. The mutual disgust was instant, total, and lifelong. They had one child, quickly, and then both retreated into separate worlds. George into powdered denial, Caroline into glorious aromatic rebellion. Where her husband cloaked his decay in brocade and ceremony, Caroline went the other way. She stopped caring, possibly out of contempt, possibly out of survival. Her clothing was wrinkled, often visibly unwashed, her undergarments rumoured to go unchanged for weeks. Court diarists, professional gossips with excellent noses, wrote that she smelled of stable. Others were less delicate, an odour of the farmyard. She sweated heavily and made no attempt to hide it. And it wasn't just body odour, it was the whole aesthetic. She let her hair go. Her hands were perpetually stained from food, ink, or worse. Her nails were chipped and dirty. Her rooms, both in Kensington and abroad, were said to be cluttered with half-eaten meals, dogs, and an unsettling smell that no bouquet could banish. Servants whispered that her linens were rarely changed, her pets slept in her bed, and she seemed to revel in the shock of it all. But this wasn't mere neglect. Caroline weaponized her filth. She knew how she was perceived, knew the court loathed her, so she leaned in. She made herself impossible to ignore, not just through scandal, but through sensory assault. There was no mistaking Caroline in a room. She wore garish colours, smelled like unwashed wool and spoiled milk, and spoke with the volume of a revolutionary. When George tried to bar her from his coronation in 1821, she showed up anyway loud, sweat-soaked, and scandalously overdressed in what some said was yesterday's perfume and last week's petticoat. And the public loved her for it. They saw in Caroline something anti-royal, something human. While the king hid behind golden walls, she walked among the people laughing, eating, sweating, stinking. She was mocked in court, but adored in the streets. London fishwives cheered her. Satirists turned her into a folk hero. Even the stink of her scandal became a kind of badge. She may have smelled like a stable, but at least she wasn't pretending to be anything she wasn't. And it wasn't all theatre. Caroline was fiercely intelligent, politically shrewd, and unafraid of confrontation. She launched counterattacks when George tried to divorce her, refusing to go quietly or cleanly. The infamous Queen Caroline affair dragged the monarchy through the mud, where, frankly, she seemed most at home. Every accusation of adultery, sloth, or filth was met not with apology, but with brazen defiance. She didn't deny she was messy. She denied it mattered. Her death, just weeks after being denied entry to George's coronation, felt almost scripted, poetic, and petty. The woman who'd spent her life being shut out of court died barred from its ultimate spectacle. And yet she left behind a different legacy, one not of grace, but of grit. A queen who refused to be sanitized. George wore a crown that smelled of rotting teeth and lies. Caroline wore no crown, but wore her stink like armor. Still, for all her calculated mess, she never devolved into the eerie stillness of the next monarch, a king whose body failed from the moment he was born, whose reign was a slow-motion collapse, and whose breath was said to turn courtiers pale. Let's descend into the dark, tragic gloom of Charles II of Spain. Charles II of Spain, 1661–1700. If Caroline of Brunswick wore her filth like a battle cry, Charles II of Spain bore his like a curse, one etched into his flesh, his breath, his brain, and even his bloodline. He was the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, a dynasty so deeply committed to inbreeding that by the time Charles was born, he was more genetic experiment than heir. They called him El Hechizado, the Bewitched. And while much was blamed on sorcery, the truth was simpler, sadder, and far more fragrant. Charles wasn't so much a man as a collapsing lineage. He had a protruding jaw so large he could barely chew, a tongue too big for his mouth, and a digestive system that malfunctioned like a cursed clock. He didn't learn to speak until he was 4, didn't walk until he was 8. By adolescence, he was already described as frail, mentally stunted, and physically repellent. And by adulthood, he had cultivated an aroma that courtiers whispered about in corners. They didn't dare say it aloud. He was still king, technically, but behind closed doors, the reports were grim. His breath, for starters, was apocalyptic. A consequence of chronic oral infections, rotting teeth, and decades of underwashing. It hovered around him like a fog. Attendants reportedly tried to keep audiences short, partly to protect his failing strength, but mostly to protect their own nostrils. The rot started in his gums and seemed to extend into his very speech, every syllable arriving on a warm gust of decay. And then there was the clothing. Charles was often dressed by his handlers. He was too weak or disoriented to manage buttons or laces, and those clothes were rarely clean. His undergarments were soiled frequently and not always changed. Attendants described the smell of his garments as lingering, especially after long audiences. The fabrics themselves seemed to absorb the air around him. A royal blend of sweat, sour breath, spoiled food, and the unmistakable mildew of unwashed flesh. His physical condition worsened with age. By his 32nd, Charles was incontinent, impotent, and completely reliant on his household to manage the wreckage of his body. Grooming became more of a symbolic act than a practical one. They combed his hair and dressed him in finery, but beneath the layers of silk, lace, and ceremonial dignity was a body that had begun to rot from within. His limbs swelled with edema, his stomach distended, his hair thinned and turned coarse. His skin took on a pale, waxy sheen, as if the body itself was trying to forget it existed. Despite all of this, the court pretended. Diplomats were sent to negotiate with him. Brides were offered in marriage. One queen fled in horror. Another simply did her duty and waited for the inevitable. His bedding had to be changed regularly, not because of custom, but because of necessity. Soiled sheets, stained nightshirts, and the smell of decay soaked into the pillows. And yet, he lived, and lived, and lived. Decades passed, what anyone thought possible, as if the body refused to stop out of sheer stubborn tradition. But every breath he took, each shallow, fetid gasp was a reminder of the end, not just of a man, but of a dynasty. The Habsburgs had bred themselves into extinction, and Charles II was the living, reeking proof. When he finally died, his autopsy report was equal parts medical curiosity and horror story. His body did not contain a single drop of blood. His heart was the size of a peppercorn. His lungs corroded. His intestines gangrenous and full of pus. His body was a battlefield of slow, smelly defeat. Spain by then was ready to move on, but the scent lingered not in the air, but in the legacy. A warning from history. If you ignore genetics, you may end up with a monarch who can't walk, can't rule, and smells like he's already been embalmed. Still, at least Charles had an excuse. Madness, infirmity, a body cursed by centuries of familial ambition. The next monarch had no such defense. His descent into filth was not inherited, it was self-inflicted. Meet Charles VI of France, a king who forgot who he was, and forgot to bathe along the way. Charles VI, the Mad of France, 1368-1422. In a world where power is inherited, sometimes the only thing more dangerous than a crown is the brain beneath it. Charles VI of France began his reign with ceremony, silk, and promise, but ended it in shambles, soaked in filth and delusion. His descent into madness is often told as a political tragedy, but there's another layer, darker, smellier, and more human. The collapse of Charles VI was not just a psychological disaster, it was a sensory one. He didn't start out as the mad. Early in his reign, Charles was young, handsome, and popular, even earning the flattering nickname Charles the Beloved. But love, like cleanliness, is hard to maintain in a royal court built on superstition and instability. Around his mid-20s, something snapped. Scholars have argued endlessly over what exactly afflicted him: schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, porphyria. But one thing was certain, his mind left the throne long before his body did. The first major psychotic break came during a military expedition. Without warning, Charles turned on his own men, slaughtering several of his knights in a fit of blind rage. Afterward, he fell into catatonia. The court whispered of demons. Physicians prescribed the usual: bleeding, purging, prayers. The king emerged from his stupor days later, but he never came all the way back. His episodes became more frequent and more bizarre. He claimed he was made of glass and demanded his attendants not touch him for fear he would shatter. He forgot who he was. He forgot who his wife was. He forgot he was king. Sometimes he thought he was St. George. Sometimes he thought he was nobody. And sometimes he simply sat in silence, shaking, drooling, and reeking. Hygiene became one of the earliest casualties of his unraveling mind. During periods of lucidity, Charles was reportedly groomed, dressed, and paraded around like a functioning monarch. But in between those rare, golden windows, the king lived in a state of filth. He refused to bathe, refused to change clothes. He would wear the same stained robe for weeks. His hair grew long and matted. sometimes braided by servants just to keep it from tangling into a crown of knots. His fingernails darkened and cracked. His breath unbrushed and untreated became the sour warning of his approach. And then there were the bedchambers. When Charles sank into one of his fugue states, he often refused to leave his room. Attendants would report the smell long before they saw the king. Soiled linens, chamber pots overflowing, uneaten food left to rot by the bedside. He would urinate on himself and demand no one clean it. His stools went unchanged. The court, terrified and humiliated, did what royal courts always do in moments of horror. They lied. They called it melancholy. They wrote flowery euphemisms, but the stench in those rooms didn't lie. His wife, Isabeau of Bavaria, bore the brunt of it, politically, socially, personally. She tried to maintain order while her husband became a ghost alive, but unreachable. Once, she reportedly found him in the palace gardens, naked and raving, convinced he was being hunted by phantoms. It took multiple attendants to subdue him. They dragged him, screaming and soiled, back to the royal apartments. He wouldn't allow them to wash him. The irony is that Charles ruled during a time when the French court was increasingly obsessed with personal grooming. Perfumed handkerchiefs, scented gloves, elaborate hair rituals, none of which applied to the man on the throne. His courtiers bathed in rosewater. Charles bathed in delusion and bodily waste. And yet, power remained his. That's the grotesque miracle of monarchy. You can be mad, foul, and functionally absent, but the title sticks. For over 4 decades, France was ruled on paper by a man who believed he was glass, smelled like a latrine, and was occasionally found hiding in cupboards. When he finally died, the court exhaled. Literally, the air cleared, but his legacy lingered, the monarch who proved that when the mind goes, the body follows. Slowly, rancidly, and with all the ceremonial dignity of a rotting saint. But if Charles was mad and tragic, the next royal is something else entirely. A warlord philosopher king who believed in discipline, wore the same threadbare uniform for years, and smelled like smoke, sweat, and Prussian despair. Let's meet Frederick the Great. Frederick the Great of Prussia, 1712-1786. Frederick the Great believed in discipline, duty, and the grand, unrelenting boredom of Spartan simplicity. A man who preferred flute solos to fancy balls, stoicism to sentiment, and above all, utility over ornament. In other words, the kind of monarch who would rather rot slowly in a cold wool uniform than ever be caught dead in French cologne. And rot he very nearly did methodically, militarily, and with a faint scent of tobacco-soaked austerity. Frederick wasn't unhygienic in the soiled, sloppy way of his royal peers. No chamber pot horror stories, no bedsheets stiff with neglect. His filth wasn't one of madness, weakness, or even laziness. It was a conscious decision, a kind of philosophical war against luxury. Cleanliness, to Frederick, was something suspiciously close to vanity. And vanity was French. And the French, as far as he was concerned, were soft. He bathed rarely. Not never, but rarely. To do so too often, he believed, weakened the skin and the soul. Warm water was decadence. Soap was an indulgence. Instead, he opted for the Prussian rinse, which consisted of wiping one's body down with a damp cloth, possibly after a long march, possibly while fully dressed, possibly never. His clothes? Always the same. Simple, frayed military uniform, often the same one for weeks or months on end. Not just the same style, but the same set. Tailors were ordered not to replace it, but to repair it, stitch by stitch, until the fabric resembled something more philosophy than fashion. The Prussian blue of his coat eventually faded to something closer to battlefield grey. His boots were worn thin, his cuffs smelled of pipe smoke and old wool. His underlayers, when changed, showed signs of sweat and age. And when not changed, they announced themselves. Attendants quietly admitted that the king carried a smoky musk, a pungent blend of dried tobacco, sweat, and damp wool that clung to his person like an aura. Visitors often described it as masculine in their more generous reports, but diplomats, especially the French, were known to complain privately. One even remarked that the king smelled of barracks and stubbornness. Frederick, of course, didn't care. He loathed court life, rejected flattery, and slept on a narrow cot with a thin blanket. He had no mistress, no heirs, no children, only dogs, military plans, and volumes of poetry. Even his dogs, it should be said, were kept cleaner than he was. One valet reportedly joked that the royal greyhounds bathed more often than the king. It wasn't really a joke. What makes Frederick's dirtiness particularly fascinating is how performative it was. This wasn't the grime of neglect, it was the grime of principle. He rejected ornamentation as weakness, comfort as corruption. His enemies powdered their wigs and soaked in rosewater. Frederick wrote military treatises in a uniform that hadn't seen a wash basin in weeks. One wonders if he could actually smell himself. If he did, he likely didn't mind. The body, he once wrote, was a vehicle of the mind, and vehicles don't need to be pleasant, only functional. Yet, despite or because of his abrasive hygiene, Frederick inspired admiration. His soldiers loved him, his people feared and respected him. He ruled Prussia into a military and intellectual powerhouse. Voltaire, who briefly lived at his court, once commented that Frederick was the philosopher king of a muddy battlefield. That mud was real, and so was the smell. When he died, alone except for his dogs, the court quietly cleaned his chambers for the first time in years. The walls still smelled of pipe, smoke, and worn leather. His mattress was yellowed. His coats, stacked like relics, held on to decades of sweat and smoke. But he left behind a legacy of iron, not gold, not perfume, not pearls. Iron, rigid, cold, and faintly damp. But if Frederick's filth was a calculated rejection of vanity, the next royal took it in the opposite direction. A spider king who wallowed in superstition, wore greasy caps, and preferred the company of horses to hygiene. Enter Louis XI of France, where the odour was less military and more medieval. Louis XI of France, 1423–1483. There are kings who rot quietly decomposing beneath silks and divine right, and then there is Louis XI, the Spider King, who seemed to come out of the womb already halfway mummified. Gaunt, twitchy, and always half hidden under layers of superstition, Louis ruled France with a paranoiac's hand and a hermit's stench. He was the kind of monarch whose hygiene wasn't just poor, it was ideologically opposed to cleanliness. Forget Versailles, forget golden spoons, embroidered linens, powdered faces. Louis XI was the king of damp castles, greasy robes, and the strong smell of wet wool. He dressed like a peasant in mourning and lived like he had a vendetta against soap. Even in the 15th century, when cleanliness was more suggestion than standard, he was considered a strange and grimy outlier. His clothes were infamous. Worn, patched, and perpetually stained, they were more suited to a stable boy than a monarch. He preferred old hunting gear to courtly attire, mud-smeared boots, dark tunics, and woolen caps so greasy they could probably stand up on their own. These weren't fashion choices, they were shields. Louis cultivated an image of humility so extreme it circled back into theatrical eccentricity. But beneath the performance was a man whose hygiene bordered on contempt for the human body. He rarely changed his clothes. His undergarments, if you could call them that, were seldom washed. His signature headwear, those greasy felt caps, were worn for weeks at a time, soaking up the oils from his scalp like a sponge with delusions of grandeur. His body smelled of horses and old leather, mingled with the mildewed scent of someone who refused the bath with the intensity of a monk dodging sin. He carried that aroma into audiences, meetings, royal decrees, into the very fabric of French politics. Louis ruled like a spider, yes, but a spider nesting in its own musk. Part of this was strategy. He loathed the ornate rituals of court life, distrusted nobles, and believed that simple clothing and, apparently, a healthy crust of grime gave him an edge over those who preened. While his rivals wore perfume, he wore suspicion. While they bathed, he plotted. While they flossed, he whispered into the shadows. And while they whispered about his smell, he was listening. Because he always listened. Louis XI was deeply superstitious. Obsessed with saints, relics, amulets, anything that might keep the devil, or death, at bay. But strangely, not water, not soap, not the basic rituals of keeping flesh from turning swampy. In his later years, he isolated himself more and more, retreating to fortified castles where he would spend days in prayer, reading, or just pacing in the same garments he'd worn since the previous week or month. Servants dreaded entering his chambers, not because he was cruel, but because he was damp. The air inside reeked of sweat, old wool, horse grease, and that sweet and sour tinge that comes from a man who hasn't touched fresh linen in a while. The walls were hung with icons and charms to ward off death, but nothing to ward off mildew. Attendants scrubbed what they could, but Louis himself resisted all intervention. The idea of letting someone wash his hair, his feet, or his body, unthinkable, possibly treasonous. Despite his habits, or perhaps because of them, Louis XI outlived many of his enemies. He ruled longer than anyone expected, long enough to reshape France into a stronger, more centralized state. His filth, like everything else about him, was tactical, a form of camouflage, a rejection of the glittering trap of kingship. He didn't want to be admired. He wanted to be feared. When he died, shriveled and worn, his body was a reflection of his reign. Dry, tight-fisted, and resistant to any softening. The coroners may not have said it aloud, but the royal corpse likely told its own story, one soaked in sweat, fear, and the musk of a king who never washed off the smell of war. But while Louis waged war in muddy boots and superstition, across the world another emperor stewed in stranger filth, one who avoided water not out of fear, but out of alchemical ambition. The Jiajing emperor of Ming China was not merely dirty, he was sanctified in grime. Jiajing emperor of Ming China, 1507–1567. Some monarchs avoid bathing because they're lazy, others because they're mad. But the Jiajing emperor of Ming China avoided it because he believed water clean, ordinary water could kill him, not metaphorically, not spiritually, literally. To cleanse the body, in his eyes, was to weaken it. To wash was to invite death through the pores. So, he didn't. He wasn't just unwashed, he was theologically filthy. Born Ju Hukong, the Jiajing emperor took the throne in 1521, but he never wanted to rule. From the beginning, he treated the empire like an inconvenient rumor. While the Ming court waited for leadership, he retreated physically, politically, and hygienically into the dark alchemy of Taoist mysticism. He surrounded himself, not with ministers, but with exorcists and immortal seekers. He didn't govern, he brooded. He didn't issue decrees. He experimented with potions, mercury, and terrifying new ways to extend his own life. He wasn't trying to be a great emperor, he was trying to cheat death. And nothing, in his view, cheated death better than filth. Cleanliness, according to the Taoist hermits he surrounded himself with, washed away the body's protective oil's essential shields against malevolent spirits. Water opened the skin. It released the qi. It left a man exposed to ghosts. And so Jiajing ordered that he not be bathed, not by eunuchs, not by concubines, not by physicians. His body was to be left untouched, sealed in its natural state, fermenting in holy neglect. The consequences were legendary. He constructed the infamous West Park at the Forbidden City, a cloistered maze of hidden chambers, private laboratories, and ritual altars. No ministers, no bureaucrats, just him, a dwindling harem of terrified concubines, and the putrid scent of immortality gone sour. The eunuchs who served him, many of them forcibly castrated children, mind you, complained in whispered journals about the unbearable smell of the West Park. The staleness, the claustrophobia, the feeling of being swallowed by a room that had not been aired in years. They begged to be reassigned. Some went mad, others simply disappeared. And the emperor? He thrived in it. He drank mercury-laced elixirs, meditated on blood-stained scrolls, and collected rare herbs from all over the empire, not to heal, but to preserve. His clothing was rarely changed. When it was, it had to be done without touching his skin. The sweat-stained silks were carefully peeled off by eunuchs wearing gloves, while the new ones were wafted over him with incense before being slipped on, like offerings to a living corpse. His breath was said to smell like old medicine and bad copper. His fingernails grew long and cracked, his teeth yellowed. His skin grew pale, then sallow, then greenish. But still, he refused to cleanse, to purify, to break the sacred stink that he believed kept death at bay. His concubines, some of whom were forced into his bed before puberty, were required to fast, remain silent, and undergo their own ritual cleansing before approaching him. They were not allowed to touch him. They were not allowed to make eye contact. They were simply vessels sanitized for his contamination. When some of them eventually rebelled, trying to poison his daily concoction of deer, penis, and arsenic, he had them tortured, executed, and buried in secret graves beneath the palace. Cleanliness, apparently, was treason. As he aged, the emperor's body began to rot faster than his doctrine could keep up. His joints stiffened, his breath wheezed, his vision blurred. He developed sores, but still he would not bathe. Death, when it came, found him sitting in his sanctum, surrounded by smoke, incense, dried herbs, human ash, and the unholy bouquet of 40 years of divine neglect. He left behind no reforms, no victories, just a government in shambles, a harem in ruins, and a palace that had to be ritually cleansed for months before anyone else could step foot inside. He chased immortality through filth and ended up a cautionary tale marinated in his own superstitions. But if Jiajing turned his body into a sacred cesspool, the next emperor turned his quarters into an unholy frat house. Less ritual, more debauchery. Meet the Zhengde emperor, a ruler who bathed in vice and absolutely nothing else. Zhengde, emperor of Ming China, 1491-1521. The Zhengde emperor didn't want to be an emperor. What he really wanted was to be a pirate, or a general, or a magician. Or, perhaps, just a perpetually drunk teenager with an unlimited budget and zero adult supervision. Unfortunately for the Ming dynasty, he was all of those things at once, and he took the throne at 14. What followed was a decade-long bender dressed in imperial robes and steeped in grease, grime, and decadence so unchecked that the palace itself began to smell like a cautionary tale. Unlike his successor, the ritualistically filthy Jiajing emperor, Zhengde's filth was not sacred, it was pure, ecstatic negligence. His reign was an act of rebellion against every courtly standard. Officials sent in reports about his erratic behavior. He responded by ignoring them and building what would become the infamous Leopard Quarter, a private pleasure palace within the Forbidden City where rules, hygiene, and the natural laws of air circulation went to die. It started small. A few favoured concubines, some exotic animals, a side of pork that maybe wasn't refrigerated properly. But soon, the Leopard Quarter became a world unto itself, a sealed-off dreamscape of sensory overload. Courtiers weren't allowed in, ministers were blocked from entering. Even loyal eunuchs, who had served the throne for years, were replaced with new favourites who understood the emperor's true priority: uninterrupted vice. He spent days, sometimes weeks, inside that walled debauchery, refused to hold court, refused to bathe, refused to wear clean clothes. His garments would stiffen with sweat and food oils before being peeled off and replaced with equally soiled robes. The stench, according to documents left by distressed palace attendants, was unbearable. The rooms were sweltering and airless. The linens were left unchanged, rotting food piled in corners. The air became heavy with animal musk because, yes, he kept leopards inside and the smell of stale wine, vomit, and human waste. Because he didn't just drink in the Leopard Quarter, he drank until his face turned purple. He drank until he passed out. Then he woke up, drank more, and let his attendants mop the floor if they were allowed in. Often, they weren't. His hair was unwashed, often matted to his scalp. His breath, according to a rare surviving court memo, was fragrant with rot, which is the poetic Ming dynasty way of saying he smelled like a corpse on vacation. When he wasn't drinking or groping his latest mistress, he was playing with caged animals, tigers, leopards, monkeys, parrots, and ordering lavish feasts that went uneaten, left to spoil under silk-draped tables, while the emperor wandered around in half-buttoned robes, shouting imaginary orders at imaginary battles. And then there were the role plays. Zhengde would dress as a commoner and sneak out of the palace in disguise, only to be followed by a full retinue, carrying his imperial seals, costumes, and ceremonial weapons. In these excursions, he would refuse to wash, sleep in inns, eat greasy street food, and return to court days later stinking of sweat, booze, and the glorious aroma of rejection. A monarch who wanted to live as anyone but a monarch. Officials begged him to return to decorum. Ministers wrote pleading memorials. Some tried to clean the Leopard Quarter while he slept, only to be banished, or worse, beaten. Cleanliness was treason. Order was oppression. Dirt was freedom. He died young. Of course he did. He drowned, according to most accounts, after falling off a boat during one of his drunken escapades. He was 30. No heir, no legacy. Just the lingering smell of wine-soaked misrule and a section of the Forbidden City that had to be scrubbed, purified, and re-sanctified before another ruler could even consider walking through it. But at least Zhengde's squalor was loud, erratic, and confined to his party palace. The next royal didn't party. He sat still, sickly, stinking in silence. Meet Peter III of Russia, a Tsar who wore uniforms like burial shrouds and who smelled like spoiled brandy and imperial embarrassment. Peter III of Russia, 1728, 1762. Some rulers are remembered for their achievements, others for their grandeur. Peter III of Russia is remembered, if at all, as the man who smelled like he slept in his own spilled beer, and very possibly did. His reign was brief, his dignity shorter still, and his hygiene, well, let's say it was the kind that lingers in a room long after the person leaves. Peter wasn't Russian by birth. He was a German duke, imported like a human consignment into the Romanov bloodline. He barely spoke Russian. He preferred playing soldier to being Tsar. and from the moment he arrived at court, people began noticing something was off, not just politically, but olfactorily. He carried an odor that trailed behind him like a bad decision, stale, sour, and unmistakably fermented. Descriptions from his wife, the soon-to-be Catherine the Great, are not kind. In her famously scathing memoirs, she paints a picture of a man more suited to a dusty Prussian barracks than a winter palace. Peter, she says, was unkempt, careless, and often appeared in front of courtiers with his shirt untucked, his breeches wrinkled, and the smell of alcohol clinging to him like a second skin. And it wasn't just the booze. Though, to be fair, there was plenty of that. Peter had a drinking habit so enthusiastic that foreign envoys were routinely shocked by his lack of restraint. But the real horror was his daily presentation, or lack thereof. He often wore the same military uniform for days, sometimes weeks, refusing to change unless prodded. And by the time he was pried out of one coat, it had soaked up enough body odor to qualify as its own entity. Servants who handled his clothing after he undressed were said to wrinkle their noses or simply hold their breath. His boots never polished, his hair rarely washed, his fingernails rimmed in dirt. Catherine wrote that his skin often had a greyish tinge, as if cleanliness had not so much been forgotten as rejected outright. Even during formal audiences, Peter would arrive looking vaguely crumpled, like a child who had lost a fight with a wardrobe. He sometimes smelled of spoiled food, most likely from snacks kept in his pockets or half-eaten meals abandoned under furniture in his chambers. Then there were his strange attachments. Peter loved his toy soldiers, obsessively. He would spend hours alone in his room, arranging them into regiments, barking orders, and conducting pretend battles with the seriousness of a 5-year-old playing general. Visitors were disturbed not by the play childish kings were nothing new, but by the surrounding conditions. The floors were often sticky with spilled liquor. Food scraps dotted the tabletops. The room reeked of sweat, grease, tobacco, and sour drink, and yet he seemed perfectly comfortable in it. What made Peter's filth particularly troubling wasn't just its physicality, it was what it signaled: a complete detachment from statecraft, from decorum, from adulthood itself. He didn't care that he smelled. He didn't care that his uniform was soiled. He didn't care that courtiers stood 2 steps back when he spoke. He was too busy making military proclamations to his miniature regiments. By the time he actually took the Russian throne in 1762, he had already alienated nearly everyone around him. Catherine, ambitious and clean by comparison, watched as her husband misruled and marinated. His policies were erratic, his hygiene worse. The stench of his body became a metaphor for the disorder of his mind, fermenting, neglected, and too far gone for redemption. He lasted 6 months. Catherine staged a coup. Peter was arrested, imprisoned, and shortly afterward dead under mysterious circumstances. The official story involved a quarrel. The unofficial story: smothered, possibly while drunk and half-dressed. His body, according to some accounts, had to be perfumed heavily before display. Peter III was not mourned. He left behind no legacy but a cautionary tale about bad grooming and worse governance. But if Peter was a mess with a title, the next royal was something even more pitiful, a corsar so frail, so neglected, that his very presence in court smelled like death, warmed over. Enter Ivan V of Russia, the forgotten brother with the unforgettable stench. Ivan V of Russia, 1666-1696. Ivan V of Russia was a czar in name, a shadow in practice, and a burden in body. Crowned co-ruler alongside his half-brother Peter the Great, Ivan was the kind of monarch who never ruled, rarely spoke, and mostly just decomposed in real time, while still technically alive. His courtly presence was described as subdued. his hygiene, less charitably, as disturbing. He was a man whose own attendants sometimes flinched when tasked with entering his room, and not because of politics. From birth, Ivan was a tangle of illness, blind in one eye, rickety in stature, and possibly developmentally delayed. He came into the world as a human warning label on Romanov inbreeding. When his elder brother Fyodor III died childless, the Russian court faced a dilemma. Peter, the vigorous and towering future Tsar, was young, but Ivan, technically the elder half-brother, was next in line. So they split the crown in two. But only one of them bathed. Ivan spent most of his reign slumped on thrones, lying in ornate beds, or being wheeled into ceremonial events like a piece of sacred furniture, solemn, dressed in finery, and vaguely moist. Court accounts describe him as passive, silent, and riddled with infirmities. He spoke slowly, if at all. He walked with difficulty. He seemed barely aware of the empire over which he technically ruled. And yet, even with power draped across his shoulders like a fur-lined noose, the worst part wasn't the helplessness. It was the smell. Ivan suffered from chronic illnesses, physical and neurological, and with them came a slow but steady erosion of his grooming. Personal cleanliness, in his case, was not just overlooked, but quietly abandoned. His body, fragile and stiff, resisted touch. Servants tasked with dressing and cleaning him often had to do so through a mix of gentle coercion and whispered prayers. His fingernails were sometimes left to grow until they curled. His hair went uncombed. His breath, ravaged by rotting teeth and poor digestion, reportedly lingered like a fog long after he had been wheeled away. His clothing, once royal and ornate, began to show signs of wear, and not the charming, lived-in kind. Stains, folds, unwashed underlayers. Ministers attending to him during council meetings occasionally described a faint sickroom odour, that unmistakable blend of body oil, damp linen, and human frailty that wafts from a bed too long occupied. His bedchamber was, by all accounts, a shrine to inertia. The curtains remained drawn, the air stale. Windows rarely opened, perhaps because the outside world was too loud, or perhaps because even the breeze couldn't be trusted not to knock the Tsar off balance. Food trays collected in corners. Soiled clothing was removed only after days of negotiation. One bold chamberlain, driven mad by the stink, reportedly defied protocol and opened a window in winter, earning both a reprimand and, briefly, breathable air. But no one spoke of this publicly. Ivan was, after all, still Tsar, technically co-Tsar, but no one wanted to test the fine print of divine right. So they wheeled him in, let him nod, prayed he didn't speak, and hoped no one noticed the dark patches under his sleeves or the odour that clung to the tapestry long after he had gone. He died at 29, after years of quietly decaying in ceremonial robes. His death was not mourned so much as absorbed. The crown passed to Peter in full, and with it, the memory of a half-reign defined by silence, sickness, and the faint smell of a body slowly giving up. But Ivan's story is not the saddest on this list. That distinction belongs to the next monarch, a king with a crown and a brilliant mind, crumbling under the weight of madness. A man whose filth came not from illness of the body, but the chaos of the mind. Enter Christian VII of Denmark, erratic, obscene, and increasingly unclean. Christian VII of Denmark, 1749-1808. Some monarchs rot from indulgence, others from madness. Christian VII of Denmark managed to do both, and then some. His reign was not so much a descent into chaos as a slow-motion nosedive, riddled with scandal, cruelty, and the pungent hallmarks of a king who neither cared for ruling nor for basic human hygiene. He wasn't merely unclean, he was ferally unclean, a creature of habit without discipline, a royal degenerate with a crown and a smell that stuck to people like a traumatic memory. From the outside, Christian looked the part. Handsome in his youth, with fine aristocratic features and a fashionably pale complexion, he entered the stage of European monarchy like a carefully powdered candle, fragile, flickering, already halfway to burnt out. But within a few short years, the glow faded, and what remained was a haunted, twitching man-child who spat on etiquette and sweated through his silks. He was crowned King of Denmark and Norway at the age of 17, and even then, the cracks were showing. He exhibited signs of severe mental illness early on, likely schizophrenia, possibly bipolar disorder, certainly something number one 8th century physician had the tools or imagination to diagnose properly. He would mumble to himself in multiple voices, burst into sudden fits of rage, and then go silent for hours, staring into the middle distance like he was watching a ghost play chess. And with that mental unraveling came the rot. His grooming habits deteriorated swiftly and publicly. Once known for his elaborate outfits and carefully styled wigs, Christian began refusing to change his clothes for days at a time. His court tailors, previously employed to trim and tailor his royal wardrobe, were now tasked with emergency repairs on sweat-stiffened coats and undergarments that reeked of urine and body odor. His chamberlains rode quietly, of course, of the unpleasant atmosphere that followed him into rooms. He stopped washing his hands. His nails grew long and dirty, often caked with whatever he had been touching. Food, paper, dirt, or worse. His hair, once powdered and curled, was left greasy and wild, falling over his eyes as he wandered the palace halls, muttering and sometimes laughing to himself. Servants would report seeing him standing shirtless at windows, licking the glass, or crouched behind doors, listening for imagined threats. He refused to bathe, sometimes for weeks. When forced to by his exasperated attendants, he would shout obscenities, thrash, or simply weep. The royal bath became a battleground, and more often than not, the king won by sheer force of stubborn insanity. His bedchambers were said to reek, the linens damp and unwashed, the bedposts smeared with fingerprints. Food would rot uneaten beside his bed, and he would sleep surrounded by half-empty glasses and stale bread crusts, like a banquet thrown by a corpse. But Christian's filth wasn't just physical, it was behavioral. He developed a habit of masturbating compulsively in court, during council meetings, even while being dressed. Ministers tried to pretend nothing was happening. They didn't dare stop him. After all, he was the king, so they endured it. The smell, the shame, the bizarre grunts and giggles coming from behind velvet screens. He would also strike himself, sometimes slapping his own face during public events, or scratch at his arms until they bled. Physicians prescribed everything from cold baths to leeches. Nothing helped. Except perhaps Johann Struensee. Struensee was a German physician and Enlightenment thinker who became Christian's personal doctor and, for a brief and brilliant moment, the true ruler of Denmark. He cleaned Christian up, calmed him down, even convinced him to bathe more often. Under his influence, Denmark saw a surge in modern reforms and some glimmers of royal dignity. But the court hated Struensee, and when his affair with Queen Caroline Matilda came to light, the backlash was swift. Struensee was executed, the Queen exiled, and Christian was left alone, filthy, broken, and once again lost in his own rotting mind. For the next 30 years, he would remain king in name only, a ghost in soiled robes haunting the corridors of Fredericksburg. By the end, even the court had stopped pretending. He smelled of old sweat, damp fabric, and failure. And yet, Compared to the next royal on our list, a queen who abandoned courtly grooming not out of madness but deliberate rebellion, Christian almost smells like a tragedy. Because Queen Christina of Sweden? She chose to stink. Queen Christina of Sweden, 1626–1689. To call Queen Christina of Sweden eccentric is like calling a battlefield messy. She was brilliant, erratic, iconoclastic, and theatrical in the way only someone raised in a palace, armed with a Renaissance education and completely uninterested in anyone's opinion could be. She hated tradition. She hated constraint. She hated expectations, especially the ones that smelled like soap, silk, and polite womanhood. Christina wasn't just unwashed. She was uncivilized by choice. Her filth wasn't born of neglect or madness, it was a manifesto, a pointed rejection of the powdered, perfumed hypocrisy of court life. While her peers were being laced into corsets and tutored in the art of subtle flirtation, Christina was reading Descartes, fencing in men's boots, and wearing the same stained breeches for days. And no one, especially not her ladies-in-waiting, could pretend not to notice. From a young age, she made her position clear. She would not be softened, powdered, or perfumed. Her father, King Gustavus Adolphus, had raised her to be a ruler, not a duchess in a glass case. She was crowned as king, not queen. Dressed in male attire, rode horseback like a soldier, and bathed like one. Too, which is to say, barely. By the standards of 17th century nobility, where hygiene rituals were already questionable, Christina's habits were shocking. She often went days, sometimes over a week, without changing her clothes. Her hair was unruly and frequently greasy. Her fingernails, bitten and darkened with ink and dust. Her breath, according to foreign envoys, could turn a diplomatic audience into a test of endurance. When the French ambassador visited her court, he reportedly remarked that she looked tired, unwashed, and stubbornly male, which was, essentially, her brand. Her living quarters matched her appearance, cluttered, chaotic, and unclean. Books stacked haphazardly, half-eaten meals left beside ancient manuscripts, piles of clothing that smelled like a battlefield after rain. Her bed was reportedly never made the same way twice. She refused the help of chambermaids and would often sleep in her clothes, boots and all, claiming it helped her wake up ready for battle. What battle, exactly? She never clarified. What she despised most was the expectation of royal femininity. Cleanliness, to Christina, wasn't just about hygiene, it was submission. It was a ritual of control. Every bath, every hair combed into place, every corset tugged tight was a reminder that her body was not hers. So, she refused to participate. She sweat openly. She swore like a soldier. She mocked courtiers who tried to correct her behavior. If she caught a lady-in-waiting spraying perfume, she would snatch it away and throw it out the window. And then there was the issue of her wardrobe. Christina's daily attire blurred every boundary. She dressed in men's suits, loose trousers, hunting boots, and dark cloaks. And she wore them for days, sometimes weeks, until they were visibly crusted with dust and sweat. Her favourites were rarely washed, their odours described by palace attendants as persistent and earthy, though some preferred the less poetic, rancid. Diplomats were baffled. Some assumed she was hiding a secret illness. Others accused her of being possessed. When she finally abdicated the throne at age 27, claiming boredom, exhaustion, and disgust with worldly things, many assumed she would settle into the quieter, cleaner life of a royal exile. Instead, she moved to Rome, converted to Catholicism, and doubled down on being an unmanageable enigma. There, she scandalized the papal court, refused to marry, kept male companions, continued to dress in men's clothing, and, true to form, was described by her hosts as deliberately unkempt. Her Roman apartments were reportedly filled with books, relics, clutter, and a thick odour of neglect. Her hair, once dark and sharp, turned wiry and grey, still rarely brushed. She walked the streets with the gait of a soldier and the smell of a hermit. When she died in 1689, she was buried in St. Peter's Basilica, an astonishing honour given her scandalous lifestyle. And though the Vatican likely cleaned her corpse for display, you can't help but wonder, did they hesitate when they opened the door to her final chamber? Because Christina didn't just challenge gender, politics, or religion. She challenged the very idea that royalty had to be clean to be powerful. But not all queens embraced grime with such pride. Some tried valiantly to preserve their image even as their bodies decayed from within. Like the next monarch, Mary Fire of England, whose breath became so infamous, courtiers called it fire. Mary I of England, 1516–1558. They called her Bloody Mary, but they could have just as easily called her Halitosis Mary. The daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, Mary I of England was a tragic figure, born into a world already steeped in sweat, rot, and political backstabbing, but she brought a unique, sharp edge to it. It wasn't just her religious zeal or her fondness for burning heretics that made her unforgettable. It was her breath, her weaponized breath. Even by the generous olfactory standards of Tudor England, where most noblemen reeked of mutton, mead, and unwashed tights, Mary's breath was legendary. Courtiers joked, quietly of course, that she spoke with fire. Ambassadors from foreign courts braved the English chill, the political storms, and the religious violence, but many privately admitted that nothing prepared them for the Queen's close-range conversation. The cause, as with so many royal smells, was dental. Mary's teeth were in a state of steady collapse by her 30s. Years of poor diet, inadequate dental care, and whatever the 16th century version of brushing might have been, think chewing herbs and praying left her mouth in ruin. She suffered from severe tooth decay, gum disease, and what appears to have been chronic oral infections, abscesses that may have bled and drained into her mouth, compounding the problem. And she hated doctors, hated them. Her fear of dental procedures bordered on phobia, and she refused to allow extractions even when the pain became unbearable. She lived and ruled, with a mouth full of rotting teeth, and a breath so acrid it became diplomatic legend. When she met with the Spanish ambassador to discuss her marriage to Philip of Spain, he reportedly kept a lace kerchief to his face not to weep with joy, but to avoid the full blast of royal exhalation. And yet, there was no hiding from it. Mary was not shy. She was politically aggressive, emotionally intense, and deeply invested in every decision that crossed her throne. She leaned in when she spoke, eyes sharp, voice forceful, and breath sulphurous. Court painters immortalized her as stern and pale, draped in velvets and rubies. But no portrait could capture the smell. Her hygiene beyond the mouth was better than some of her contemporaries. She did, reportedly, change her clothes with reasonable frequency and preferred modest, simple gowns. But, like many royals of her day, bathing was rare. Water was viewed with suspicion. Bathing too often, they believed, weakened the body and encouraged illness. So, she, like most, relied on perfume, linen, and the occasional sponge bath, delivered by ladies-in-waiting, who learned quickly how to breathe through their mouths. Still, it was the breath that defined her, because it spoke not only of dental disaster, but of something deeper, a woman under siege by her own body. Mary suffered from intense abdominal pain, irregular menstrual cycles, and most famously false pregnancies. Twice, during her brief reign, she announced that she was with child. Her belly swelled. Her breasts became tender. She began preparing for childbirth, and then nothing. no baby. Just the slow, humiliating retreat back into silence. Historians now suspect Mary may have suffered from phantom pregnancies caused by hormonal imbalances or even uterine cancer. Whatever the cause, it added layers of suffering, paranoia, and yes, stench. She perspired heavily during these periods, wore heavy gowns in summer, and was seen fanning herself desperately during court appearances. Her body was failing. Her breath was only the most immediate symptom. In her final years, the pain worsened. She grew pale, gaunt, and irritable. Her teeth blackened further. Her body, bloated by illness, emitted what one attendant described as a foul heat. The palace began to reek of illness. Attendants burned incense in the halls. Physicians visited, recoiled, and recommended prayer. When Mary died at just 42, the court moved swiftly to prepare the body for burial. It was reported that the embalmers worked quickly, perhaps to get ahead of the inevitable decomposition, or perhaps simply because they wanted to be done with it. She left no children, no heir, just a kingdom weary from executions and her final, lingering aroma of sacred rot. But at least Mary suffered with dignity. The next queen was less careful, less royal, more raw. Anne of Great Britain didn't just sweat through her linens, she sank into them. Anne of Great Britain, 1665, 1714. Queen Anne ruled over the Union of England and Scotland, but she couldn't rule over her own body. She was the last of the Stuart monarchs, a sovereign marked by tragedy, chronic illness, and a slow, suffocating collapse into physical misery. Hers was not the theatrical filth of debauchery, nor the rebellious grime of philosophical defiance. Anne's uncleanliness was quieter, domestic, sorrowful, and rooted in a body that betrayed her again and again. Anne was perpetually in pain. From adolescence, she suffered from a cocktail of medical conditions: gout, dropsy, edema, obesity, migraines, and gynecological problems so severe they left her infertile. She endured at least 17 pregnancies, none resulting in a surviving heir. Miscarriages, stillbirths, infant deaths, one after another, leaving her not just childless, but hollowed. Each pregnancy damaged her further. Her joints inflamed, her legs swelled, and her strength vanished. In her later years, she could barely walk and was often carried around the palace in a sedan chair like a damp statue, silent, royal, and steadily ripening. And the smells followed. Anne was not deliberately filthy. She was simply too broken to keep up. Her body leaked, her clothes soaked through. Her breath, heavy and often gasping, was tinged with sourness from persistent gastrointestinal distress. Attendants spoke, behind closed doors, of the thick air in her bedchamber, a mixture of sweat, poultices, wet linens, spoiled creams, and the vaguely metallic scent of open sores. Her court was overly perfumed to compensate. Lavender and orange blossom sachets were tucked into chair cushions. Candles were lit during the day. Windows opened discreetly, despite drafts. But it wasn't enough. Even with layers of powder and perfume, Anne gave off what one courtier politely called a sick-room scent, and what another, less polite, described as a queen who had forgotten to wake. The worst of it was the sweating. Anne's weight fluctuated drastically over the years, her appetite oscillating between restrained and ravenous, but her sweating remained constant. It poured from her skin, especially in moments of pain or stress. Her bodices would soak through in court. Her sleeves darkened at the underarms. Her nightgowns clung to her in the mornings, reeking of sour perspiration and old bedding. The linens on her massive four-poster bed were changed as often as possible, but still they suffered. Long-serving ladies of the bedchamber grew accustomed to the scent, but visitors could not ignore it. And Anne knew. That's what made it worse. She was painfully self-conscious, deeply religious, and burdened with the knowledge that her body was not fit for the throne or even for her own expectations. She once said, in a private letter, that her flesh was an affliction sent by God, and that every day in it was a trial. Unlike other monarchs who denied their decay, Anne lived with it openly. She asked for forgiveness before being touched. She apologized to her staff when her legs leaked fluid. She knew she stank, and that shame hung around her like a second scent. Still, she ruled. Through illness, pain, and public scrutiny, she held together a fragile kingdom. She signed treaties with trembling hands. She governed through periods of war and change. And all the while, her body whispered rebellion beneath her gown, oozing, sweating, rotting quietly beneath velvet and lace. In her final years, her body began to collapse entirely. Her skin broke open. Ulcers formed. Her eyes clouded. The swelling in her legs made even sitting difficult. Some mornings, she couldn't move at all. The sickroom scent turned sourer, heavier. Her appetite vanished. She slept upright, propped by pillows, barely able to breathe. When she finally died in 1714, it was said that the bedchamber took days to air out. A full cleaning was ordered. Curtains burned, bedding replaced. She left behind no children, and a reputation often reduced to her obesity and melancholy. But her filth wasn't frivolous. It was the stench of suffering a life spent in pain, wrapped in ritual, unable to cleanse what the body refused to heal. But if Anne's odour was one of helplessness, the next king used perfume like a battlefield and lost. Louis XVIII of France tried to hide his own rot with clouds of cologne and the tight seal of denial. Spoiler, it didn't work. Louis XVIII of France, 1755–1824. Louis XVIII was a man who loved order, preferably at a distance. He liked symmetry, hierarchy, heavy curtains, and long meals served with protocols so rigid it could snap under its own silverware. But when it came to his own body, that, unfortunately, was where the order stopped and the entropy began. To understand Louis XVIII's hygiene, or rather, the elaborate performance meant to conceal the lack of it, you have to understand the man himself. He wasn't a revolutionary or a war hero. He was a placeholder, a Bourbon Restoration monarch who inherited the impossible task of pretending France hadn't just guillotined his family and danced on the ashes of the old regime. His job was to smell like tradition. And so, he perfumed. Vigorously, obsessively, relentlessly. It began with cologne, then lavender oil, then musk, then rose, layer after layer. Louis marinated in fragrances the way a roast marinates in wine. His skin glistened with scented balms. His handkerchiefs were soaked in floral water. His chambers were fogged with perfumed candles. His carriages were stuffed with potpourri sachets. Wherever he went, he brought the smell of artificial cleanliness trailing behind him like an apologetic footman. But the smell beneath the smell was the problem. Louis was in terrible health. He suffered from advanced gout, chronic obesity, and ulcers that made even walking an ordeal. His legs were grotesquely swollen, covered in sores and lesions that wept and oozed through his stockings. The smell of infection was constant raw flesh beneath perfumed cuffs. His attendants were required to change the dressings on his legs daily, sometimes multiple times, and even then, the odour soaked through. Bathing was infrequent. In part due to medical advice, warm water, they believed, might provoke inflammation, but mostly because the process itself was excruciating. The act of disrobing, lowering his aching body into a tub and enduring the burning sensation of water on open sores was more than Louis could tolerate regularly. Instead, he relied on dry cleaning rituals, dabbing with cloths, powdering his skin, and, of course, drowning it all in cologne. His valets, often selected for their discretion, grew adept at not wrinkling their noses. They aired out his bedchamber when he left. They rotated his chairs to mask the damp spots left behind. They whispered to one another about which breeches had been soaked through, which gloves smelled worst, which shoes were now off limits due to leakage. But in public, everything was immaculate: white gloves, gold embroidery, satin slippers over feet that were barely recognizable as human anymore. And his breath, the breath. Years of rich foods, rotting teeth, and a disinterest in dental care gave Louis the kind of mouth odour that could curdle diplomacy. Guests reported that private audiences required an iron stomach. Diplomats would angle themselves away as subtly as possible. Ambassadors from less hygienically rigid nations came better prepared, armed with handkerchiefs and expressions of stoic endurance. Despite this, Louis insisted on formality. No one was to speak of his condition. No one was to flinch. Etiquette was armour. He would sit, swollen and glistening, atop his ornate throne, limbs aching, body marinating in its own floral funk, and still expect a bow deep enough to hide any reaction. In his final years, Louis barely moved. His legs deteriorated to the point where walking was impossible. He spent most of his time seated, propped with pillows, his lower limbs wrapped in linen and prayers. The rot advanced. Sores became ulcers, ulcers became wounds, and the wounds began to stink more than perfume could hide. His physicians, trapped between duty and horror, treated him like a relic, fragile, sacred, and constantly in danger of falling apart. When he died in 1824, the autopsy revealed a body ravaged by years of infection and decay. But the worst part? The smell didn't surprise anyone. They had been inhaling the slow decline of Louis XVIII for years. Still, Louis had one thing going for him. He believed in perfume. The next monarch didn't believe in baths, cologne, or much of anything that didn't involve eating. Meet João VI of Portugal, the anti-bath king, and a man who made royal funk a diplomatic incident. João VI of Portugal, 1767-1826. If royalty is about pageantry, João VI was the punchline. A man so allergic to soap and water that biographers, many of whom liked him, still referred to him as the anti-bath king. In Portugal and Brazil alike, his smell became part of his legend, trailing him through palaces, colonial courts, and even into death. He was a monarch whose personal hygiene was so famously non-existent, it became a point of diplomatic commentary. Imagine offending an ambassador not with your policies, but with your presence. João was not a stupid man. In fact, he was intelligent, politically shrewd, and tactically cautious. He weathered the Napoleonic Wars, fled to Brazil, held a fragmented empire together longer than anyone expected, and even managed to outmaneuver his own treacherous son for a while. But cleanliness? That was where his wisdom ended. To João, bathing was not a ritual of renewal or self-care. It was a dangerous flirtation with death. Like many monarchs before him, he viewed water not as refreshing, but as a vector for disease. And so, he avoided it. He did not occasionally skip baths. He rejected them outright, routinely, fanatically. There are reports that João only submitted to being submerged when specifically ordered by a doctor, and even then, only if the bath could be considered medicinal. He preferred saltwater ocean baths taken from boats or, bizarrely, dragged into the surf by servants. But these were rare, and outside of them, he relied on what can only be described as a wardrobe-based cleaning method. Just keep adding more clothes. And yet, João was obsessed with clothing. He loved uniforms, layers, robes, hats. He changed outfits frequently not because the garments were dirty, but because he liked the pomp. Beneath the pomp, however, the truth was unbearable. His skin was reportedly oily and sour. His underlayers were soaked in sweat. His feet were notoriously foul, and yet he refused to wear socks regularly. Footmen tasked with removing his boots sometimes gagged. A few tried to resign. In the sweltering Brazilian heat where he relocated the Portuguese court in 1808 after Napoleon invaded the Iberian Peninsula, João's refusal to bathe became a diplomatic crisis. Foreign emissaries wrote home with horror. The tropical climate magnified the problem. Heavy robes, thick flesh, and a body that had not felt the sting of soap in months. João waddled through the halls of his Brazilian palace, surrounded by the stench of rot, body oil, and the delicate notes of whatever meal had most recently dripped onto his vest. And oh, did he eat? João was famously gluttonous. Meals were lavish, constant, and consumed messily. He developed a habit of chewing with his mouth open and often let food fall onto his chest and lap. Meat juices, wine, stewed vegetables, all of it trickled down his garments and stayed there. If a stain was particularly large, a servant might be permitted to blot it. If not, it dried. It accumulated. His court robes became maps of his dietary history. But he believed in etiquette. Sort of. When hosting audiences, he would sit upright, belly overflowing, breath heavy, and expect deference. Diplomats bowed, ministers curtsied. Everyone tried not to breathe too deeply. He rarely brushed his teeth, so his breath, thick with digestion and decay, made conversation a contact sport. His beard, when not trimmed, became sticky with condensation. At one point, a rumor spread that a live insect had taken up residence in his wig. And yet, somehow, people loved him. João had a strangely benign charisma. He was kind, approachable, and often self-deprecating. He was generous to a fault and prone to long, rambling stories delivered through Halitosis' thick monologues. He ruled with instinct more than force. He allowed Brazil to become a kingdom. He survived betrayals. But the one thing he never survived was a washcloth. When he finally died in 1826, his body was said to be in a state of profound internal deterioration, his insides as neglected as his exterior. But perhaps João had been right all along. He had avoided water and lived to 58. No small feat in his time. Still, for all his funk, he didn't weaponize filth. The next royal did. A Byzantine emperor so hated, his enemies named him after excrement. Literally. Let's talk about Constantine V, history's most hygienically slandered monarch. Constantine V, Copronymus of Byzantium. 718. 775. In the long, petty tradition of political mudslinging, Constantine V stands alone as the only emperor in recorded history to have been given a name that literally translates to dung-named, copronymus. The insult, like most Byzantine gossip, was both metaphorical and gruesomely specific. His critics said he fouled his own baptismal font as an infant, not metaphorically, physically. And from that moment on, the stink stuck. Was it true? Probably not. But truth wasn't the point. To understand the olfactory legacy of Constantine V, you have to understand the context. A world where theology wasn't just Sunday conversation, it was state policy, military strategy, and blood sport. Constantine was a fierce iconoclast, meaning he ordered the destruction of religious icons throughout the empire. To the iconophiles, the more traditional branch of the faithful, this wasn't just heresy, it was sacrilege of the highest order. And so they fought back the only way they could, with propaganda. And what better way to discredit a man than to make him smell? Copronymus wasn't a nickname whispered behind palace walls. It was chanted, written into sermons, etched into hostile chronicles. In the centuries that followed, religious texts gleefully described the emperor's filth in grotesque, almost poetic detail. His enemies claimed he was unwashed, leprous, constantly oozing, that his body exuded a stench so vile it emptied rooms, that he avoided holy water because it burned, that he dined alone not from preference, but because no one could sit beside him without gagging. They painted him as a beast of meat and mucus, an emperor with fouled garments, greasy skin, and open sores, a man whose every breath was a curse, whose robes were soaked with sin, whose touch left behind a smear. None of this was officially verified, of course. No court records mention personal hygiene. No ambassador's letter says, "The emperor smells of death and soup." But the repetition, the sheer volume of defamation suggests something else, that filth had become metaphor. That to make Constantine dirty was to make him damned. It was a remarkable propaganda campaign. They said he stank of heresy. They said flies followed him. They said his throne had to be fumigated after use. That his death left behind a smell that lingered in the palace for days. He became the embodiment of spiritual corruption so physically polluted that even the air around him was suspect. He wasn't just unholy, he was unclean. But beneath the myth, there was a man. Constantine V was not some slobbering wretch in a stained toga. He was a shrewd military commander. He spent most of his reign successfully defending the empire against Arab invasions. He fortified the army, restructured the imperial economy, and maintained internal stability better than many of his cleaner predecessors. His court functioned, his soldiers were loyal, his empire, if not perfumed, was at least intact. And yet, none of that mattered to his enemies, because in the end, they had the final word, or rather, the final nickname, Copronymus. An emperor remembered not for his victories, but for an infant accident real or imagined, and the supposed stench of his reign. It's a perfect Byzantine irony, a ruler who brought order, remembered as filth, a general who preserved the empire, immortalized as human waste. His corpse long gone, but the insult remains, whispered by historians and echoed by ecclesiastical texts for over a millennium. Because that's the curse of being called dirty in history. No matter how you lived, what you built, or who you defeated, if someone powerful enough calls you smelly, that's what you become. And speaking of slander turned legacy, the next ruler didn't need enemies to label him filthy. He earned it all on his own, through gluttony, stains, and personal chaos so cartoonish the entire ancient world winced. Meet Ptolemy VIII, Physcon, a king so slovenly his clothes had their own reputation. Ptolemy VIII, Physcon of Egypt, 182–116 BCE. History remembers Ptolemy VIII by a nickname that could double as a medical diagnosis, Physcon, meaning potbelly. That alone would be enough to signal how posterity felt about him. But the real portrait painted by ancient sources goes further fatter, fouler, and filthier. Ptolemy Physcon wasn't merely large, he was grotesque, not merely decadent, but deliberately revolting. A monarch so thoroughly loathed that even his smell became a matter of public record. Let's start with his body. Physcon was morbidly obese, even by the looser standards of ancient royal corpulence. Accounts from the period describe him as massive, greasy, and slow-moving, a man whose flesh preceded him into rooms. His bulk was not the rounded prosperity of a well-fed monarch, but the bloated, unkempt evidence of unchecked indulgence. He stuffed himself at every meal, and was known for favouring the kinds of dishes that did not travel well on hot Egyptian afternoons. Roasted meats, fatty fish, wine by the amphora, and sweet cakes that likely melted into his clothes. And it's here, at the intersection of excess and laziness, that the stench begins. Ptolemy, it seems, had little patience for the mundane rituals of personal grooming. His garments were often stained, ill-fitting, and poorly washed. According to contemporary Roman and Greek sources, his tunics clung to him like damp sheets on a wine barrel. The stench of sweat, fermented food, and bodily oils followed him like a retinue. He wore the same clothes for days, sometimes longer, despite the Egyptian heat and his own famously prolific sweating. He perspired constantly. His servants were forced to dab his forehead with linen cloths during council meetings, and some supposedly wore scarves over their noses while attending him. But the greatest horror, he would sometimes use the very same handkerchief to wipe his mouth after eating. Saliva, grease, sweat folded into one soft, putrid textile, and reused. Then there was his breath. Writers like Diodorus Siculus describe it as foul and hot, the kind of odour that made public audiences a trial of endurance. Combined with the emperor's tendency to speak closely and laugh loudly, it meant that few left his presence without some part of them smelling a little worse. But Physcon's filth wasn't only physical, it was moral. He had his enemies murdered during family dinners. He married his sister and then his niece. He exiled, maimed, and executed anyone who looked at him sideways. His reign was less a monarchy and more a slow-motion explosion of paranoia and gluttony. At one point, after being chased out of Alexandria, he returned with mercenaries and took revenge by ordering mass executions at the city's gymnasium. Blood mixed with sweat. And still he dined afterward, hands greasy, robes darkening. His debauchery was theatrical. Even his indulgences seemed engineered for horror. He held feasts where guests were too afraid to eat, not because of etiquette, but because the smell of the king turned their stomachs. Some claimed he kept live animals in his chambers, and that his personal quarters reeked of hay, feces, and stale wine. Others whispered of bed linens that were never changed, of food trays crawling with insects, of an emperor who preferred eating with his hands and wiping them on the nearest surface. And through it all, he ruled. For decades. Because this was Ptolemaic Egypt, a dynasty built on incest, spectacle, and inertia, he outlasted rebellions, outmaneuvered rivals, lived into his 60s despite his bulk and general disregard for cleanliness. His people despised him, his own family feared him, but his stench, that became legend. When he finally died, the court reportedly scrubbed the palace so thoroughly that it took weeks to erase the smell from the royal couches. But even after the scent faded, the memory didn't, because Ptolemy Physcon left behind a model of royal excess so rank, so deliberately grotesque, that even tyrants centuries later were compared to him not by their cruelty, but by the way they smelled. Still, where Physcon stank of indulgence, the next monarch's odour came from fear, paranoia, madness. Eric XIV of Sweden didn't just let himself go, he unravelled, and took his hygiene with him. Eric XIV of Sweden, 1533, 1577. There are kings who lose themselves to pleasure, and kings who lose themselves to war. Eric XIV of Sweden lost himself to fear slowly, completely, and in a cloud of his own sour sweat. By the end of his reign, he was not so much ruling as unravelling, piece by piece, locked in a prison of his own making, reeking of rot and paranoia. Eric was not always a cautionary tale in human form. In his early years, he was intelligent, multilingual, ambitious. He studied astronomy, art, and statecraft. He was tall, striking, and by some accounts, charismatic. But even then, something inside him buzzed too loudly. That particular pitch of nervous energy, the kind that makes you watch shadows a little too closely, was already humming under the surface. When he took the throne in 1560, following the death of his father, Gustav I, Eric's grip on reality began to slip. At first, it was garden-variety paranoia, distrust of nobles, suspicion of court factions, an obsessive desire to centralize power. But within a few short years, that suspicion metastasized. He believed everyone was plotting against him, that assassins moved through the walls, that the air was poisoned, that his own mind was being manipulated by demons, or more worryingly, his own brother. And this is where the filth begins. Eric stopped trusting his attendants. He stopped trusting his food. He stopped trusting the men assigned to groom him. Haircuts became acts of aggression. Baths became death traps. Razors were instruments of murder. He refused water unless he poured it himself. He kept servants at a distance and eventually dismissed many of them altogether. The result? No one got close. And no one cleaned him. His hair became wild and tangled. His beard grew patchy and unkempt. His nails lengthened, curled, and cracked. His breath soured from untreated dental rot and malnutrition. He wore the same clothes for days, sometimes weeks at a time. Robes once adorned with royal embroidery sagged with grime. His sleeves were stiff with dried sweat. His boots were worn until the leather split and his toes poked through. He began wandering the castle at night, speaking to no one, muttering to himself, hallucinating whispers in the dark. He refused to sleep in the same bed, twice in a row. He smeared symbols on his doors with whatever was available, ink, wine, blood, hoping they'd ward off invisible enemies. Some said he stopped washing his hands altogether. Others claimed he compulsively scrubbed them raw, trying to remove imaginary poisons. By the time he ordered the infamous Stur murders, personally stabbing a noble in front of witnesses, his sanity was no longer in question. He was mad, fully, irrevocably. His filth had become part of the throne, soaked into its velvet and wood like a stain no one dared clean. After his arrest and deposition, Eric's condition worsened. He was confined, first in castles, then in proper prison cells. His captors gave him food, but little else. His hygiene, already dire, became something out of a horror story. Reports from the time describe his garments as verminous. His chambers stank of urine and unwashed flesh. He spoke less and less, sometimes screaming, sometimes singing, sometimes silent for days. When his captors brought him fresh clothes, he refused to change. When they offered to clean his room, he accused them of trying to poison him. At one point, he demanded his food be delivered wrapped in cloth, untouched by human hands. Another time, he smeared the walls with food, muttering spells. Whether he was trying to ward off death or invite it remains unclear. He died in 1577, likely poisoned, whether by his own hand or someone else's. His final days were spent in filth and isolation, wrapped in the same garments he had worn for weeks, barely speaking, barely breathing, soaked in the weight of his own madness. Eric XIV's story is a portrait of decay, mental, moral, physical. A king who could have ruled brilliantly, but instead became a prisoner of his own mind, and his body followed, slowly, tragically, smelling every bit the part. But the next royal wasn't mad. He was simply indifferent, a Polish king so famously stale and sweat-slicked that even diplomats kept a fork-length distance. Let's talk about Władysław IV Vasa, smoker, soldier, and the stink of the Polish court. Władysław IV, Vasa of Poland, 1595-1648. In an era when kings were expected to be fragrant demigods, rulers who bathed in rosewater and sprinkled powdered civet over their shoulders, Władysław IV Vasa strolled into diplomatic chambers smelling like yesterday's pipe smoke and last week's shirt. He wasn't grotesque. He wasn't mad. He was simply musty. A kind of sovereign musk clung to him that no perfumed glove could quite disguise. He was a soldier king, a patron of the arts, a man of action and culture, but also of stale habits. And his scent, like his reign, was a curious mix of dignity and damp cloth. Władysław was born into the illustrious Vasa dynasty, a branch of royals with Swedish and Polish roots and, apparently, a relaxed approach to soap. Unlike the more decadent rulers of his age, Władysław wasn't infamous for gluttony or drunken orgies. His brand of hygiene neglect was subtler, steadier, less headline, more wallpaper. It began with the clothes. The king was fond of richly embroidered garments, doublets, cloaks, and flowing sleeves, often trimmed in fur or lace. But while his outerwear was princely, his underlayers told a different story. Court diaries mention lingering odours beneath his ornate robes. In winter, this could be dismissed as battlefield residue or the honest sweat of a ruler in motion. In summer, it was something closer to sour. His shirts were changed irregularly, sometimes worn well past their expiration point. One foreign diplomat noted, with diplomatic delicacy, that the king carried the air of a camp rather than a court. Then came the tobacco. Władysław smoked, constantly, pipes, cigars, whatever was available. He embraced tobacco like it was a moral principle. His fingers were yellowed, his teeth were permanently stained. His breath was described as thick, with ash and bitter leaf. He smoked during meals, during meetings, even while preparing for battle. The heavy smell of burnt tobacco hung in his personal chambers like a fog and seeped into his clothing, into his bedclothes, into the walls. Servants tried to mitigate the damage with scented sachets, dried herbs, and incense. They placed orange peels in his gloves and lavender in his drawers, but it was like trying to perfume a fireplace. The stink of smoke was not an accident, it was atmosphere. Władysław was a man who didn't just live in the haze, he carried it with him. And then there were the meals. He ate well, if not excessively. Roasted meats, cured fish, thick stews, he preferred hearty fare that lingered long after the plates were cleared. And sometimes, so did the evidence. Servants complained of food-stained cuffs and napkins that were reused too many times. Grease and wine left patterns on his sleeves, traces of feasts past. During one banquet, it was said that he dropped a morsel of goose into his lap and simply left it there. Hours later, he still hadn't changed clothes. But the most consistent complaint from foreign envoys was the general dampness of the king's person. They described a perpetual clamminess, a sweatiness that was neither fresh nor alarming, just there. His handshakes were slightly moist. His robes carried the faint mildew of garments stored without airing. His skin had that sour skin smell of someone who hasn't washed quite recently, but still manages to function in polite society. No one confronted him directly, of course. He was a king. You didn't tell a monarch he needed a bath. But they wrote about it, quietly, and often. One French ambassador commented that the king enjoyed philosophical conversation over supper, though one dared not sit too close. Another envoy from the Holy Roman Empire noted that the king's breath does not inspire the appetite. Yet, despite the scent, Władysław was respected, even liked. He championed religious tolerance. He supported the arts. He fought against the Ottomans and managed diplomacy with Sweden. His subjects admired him. His court praised him. And history remembers him, just not for how he smelled. Because sometimes the real danger isn't filth that's visible. It's the kind you accept. The kind that seeps in and stays. That lingers in wood, in fabric, in memory. And the next monarch knew all about lingering. James II of England didn't just sweat. He steamed in his own armour, slow-cooked in Catholic gilt, French fashion, and an odour that even Versailles found offensive. James II of England, 1633–1701. If James II of England had a scent, it would be somewhere between sanctified mildew and overcooked regret. He was a man who spent much of his life sweating from anxiety, sweating in full battle armour, sweating in long Catholic services, and sweating in French exile. One could say that James II didn't rule England so much as he marinated in it. Born into the decadence of the Stuart dynasty and brother to the infamously perfumed Charles II, James was expected to at least try to meet the courtly standards of personal presentation. But James wasn't like his brother. Where Charles was charming and fragrant in a haze of expensive oils and illicit affairs, James was rigid, solemn, and piously sour. His conversion to Catholicism only added to his particular smellscape because incense may be holy, but it doesn't cancel out body odour soaked into doublet and cuirass. The problem began with his armour. James fancied himself a soldier. He loved military pageantry. Loved the feel of a sword at his side, a breastplate strapped to his chest, the gleam of metal in candlelight. What he apparently did not love was taking the damned thing off. He was frequently seen at court in partial or full military dress, sometimes even during events that called for lighter clothing. His armour, usually worn over thick padded garments, collected heat and sweat like a medieval crockpot. And James? He steamed. Reports from courtiers and foreign visitors noted that he often appeared damp during public appearances. French observers who had grown used to the gilded powder puff version of royalty at Versailles were quietly appalled by James's persistence in donning sweat-heavy uniforms and refusing, it seemed, to change them often. The smell that emanated from beneath the polished exterior wasn't battlefield valour, it was mould, skin, and a hint of sanctimony. And let's not forget the Catholic rituals. As king, James leaned hard into his faith, much to the horror of Protestant England. He would sit through long, incense-choked masses in full ceremonial dress, often sweating through vestments as if trying to repent through perspiration. The combination of thick fabric, stale air, and the body's own protest created an odour that didn't read as divine. Even members of his own court noted that James tended to overheat. His servants frequently dabbed at his brow during services. His gloves, soaked with sweat, had to be dried near fireplaces overnight. And the clothes? They weren't always changed as often as they should have been. A few extra layers of sanctified wool between washes turned his piety into a slow-cooking act of olfactory warfare. Unlike his brother, James wasn't one for courtly perfume. He viewed such affectations as decadent, possibly sinful. A splash of cologne, maybe. But compared to Charles, who practically wore a cloud of jasmine and intrigue, James's approach was distinctly natural. Unfortunately for his courtiers, nature had not been kind. His breath, by all accounts, wasn't much better. Years of stress, anxiety, and a royal diet heavy on meat and light on dental hygiene meant that James often spoke with a mouthful of silent protest from his molars. Combined with the heavy clothing and the constant sweating, it meant that a close audience with James wasn't just intimidating, it was humid. But James was too busy being righteous to care. He saw himself as divinely appointed, a martyr in waiting, a king sent to save his country from heresy. And martyrs, apparently, don't bathe as often as they should. After being overthrown in the Glorious Revolution, James fled to France, where he lived out his final years in exile at the court of Louis XIV. But even in Versailles, a palace practically engineered to smell like roses and denial, James stood out. French courtiers, accustomed to powdered wigs and scented gloves, found his scent jarring. The odour of wet wool, aged leather, and theological doom was not easily covered. He died in 1701, quietly and still damp, his body swollen from years of illness and sedentary living. Whatever sanctity he hoped to project, the memory of James II remained less about righteousness and more about the pungent aroma of a king who tried to sweat his way to heaven. Still, even James's sanctified stink doesn't hold a candle to what came next, because some kings don't just avoid the bath, they avoid all forms of accountability. Enter Philip IV, the Fair of France, a man who looked immaculate and ruled with icy precision, but who may have smelled like he never touched the very bathhouses he built. Philip IV, the Fair of France, 1268–1314. The irony with Philip IV of France, nicknamed Le Bel, the Fair, is that while he looked like a marble statue and governed with a cold-blooded efficiency that would make Machiavelli nod in approval, he may have smelled like he'd spent the past few months playing hide-and-seek inside a crypt. Tall, handsome, severe, and stoic, Philip had the face of a saint and, reportedly, the hygiene of a minor demon who took Sundays off. The contradiction is striking. Here was a king who redefined the French monarchy, who crushed the Knights Templar, humiliated the papacy, and streamlined royal administration like an early modern CEO. His portraits show a man of regal symmetry, clad in pristine robes, standing tall under the weight of God's favour and unearned confidence. He looks clean, clinical, even. And yet, contemporary Italian envoys who visited Philip's court recorded impressions that were, let's say, less flattering. They noted his lack of visible bathing habits. They scoffed at the king who dressed like a holy icon but smelled like boiled leather. These were men coming from a culture where public bathhouses were not just common, but civic pride. They watched with mild horror as Philip passed laws, levied taxes, and received ambassadors, all while appearing to have not once set foot in the luxurious bathing facilities that existed within his own palaces. Because yes, those bathhouses were there. The Capetian kings had access to marble tubs, private baths, and entire bathing wings, staffed with attendants trained to scrub and perfume a monarch to near sainthood. But Philip, brilliant, brutal, and bafflingly indifferent to water, rarely used them. Reports suggest he avoided the bath with a consistency that felt almost superstitious. Whether it was for religious reasons, purity of the flesh meant not soaking in it, medical fears, a damp body invites disease, or just a deeply ingrained contempt for softness, the result was the same. Philip dressed like a jewel box and smelled like a locked one. His robes, though elegant, were often worn for days without changing. The underlayers, woolen, heavy, meant to trap warmth, also trapped sweat. Philip was known to wear fur-lined cloaks in colder months, and those furs, once dampened by the heat of the royal body, retained a musky, gamey smell that no amount of incense could quite erase. While courtiers quietly refreshed their garments with oils and crushed herbs, the king strode through court smelling like conquest and fermented upholstery. Then there were the shoes. Philip liked leather boots, good for travelling, good for war councils, good for showing your enemies that you meant business, less good when worn day after day without airing. Several accounts mention a stale odour in his quarters, which some attributed to the king's boots, left standing near the hearth overnight, steaming, no doubt, in their own quiet protest. His hair, seen in manuscripts as smooth and golden, was likely less divine up close. Brushed? Yes. Styled? Yes. Washed? occasionally, but not regularly. He wasn't known for vanity, he was known for gravity, and that gravitas came, unfortunately, with a faint layer of body oil and neglect. And yet, despite the scent, or maybe because of it, Philip was feared, revered, even admired. He didn't need to be clean, he needed to be in control. His cold demeanour, his refusal to smile, his complete absence of charm, it all fed into a myth of a king above the mess of life. And while that myth might have wilted in warmer rooms, it held up well in stone halls filled with frightened men and loyal scribes. Philip died at 46, unexpectedly after a hunting accident. His body, preserved hastily, reportedly emitted a foul stench long before burial. Monks rushed to contain the decay. The marble mask had finally cracked, and what was beneath was exactly what his enemies always suspected: rot, sweat, and silence. But if Philip's odour was the smell of hidden decay beneath political precision, the next emperor let it all hang out, literally and chemically. Because Rudolf II, Holy Roman Emperor, didn't just neglect soap. He built a kingdom of stench, surrounded by experiments, dead animals, and the thick fog of alchemical failure. Rudolf II, Holy Roman Emperor, 1552–1612. Rudolf II didn't just live in filth, he curated it. For most monarchs on this list, bad hygiene was a side effect of madness, illness, arrogance, trauma. But for Rudolf, filth was a setting, a kind of atmospheric accessory to the larger theatre of his decay. His court wasn't just dirty, it was a cult. A smelling salts on standby blend of mercury vapour, taxidermy, greasy manuscripts, and royal flesh in various stages of unwashed. This wasn't the kind of imperial elegance you'd expect from a Habsburg emperor. Rudolf ruled not from Vienna or Madrid, but from Prague Castle, which under his tenure transformed into something between a museum of wonders and a hoarder's panic attack. The man collected everything: dead animals, magical relics, scientific instruments, failed automata, preserved body parts, occult manuscripts, and alchemists. So many alchemists, and none of them seemed to own a broom. Reports from courtiers and visiting diplomats described the smell of his chambers as chemical, not sharp and sterile like modern lab odor, but sour, tangy, thick with the residue of rotting organic materials and the strange, chalky scent of things that should not be burned indoors. Mercury, sulphur, vinegar, candle wax, and God knows what else. Because Rudolf believed in transformation. He believed that somewhere in the stink of dead frogs and lead crucibles was the secret to gold or to eternal life. He hosted alchemists from across Europe, many of whom were more con artists than scientists, and gave them room to work, and what they produced, beyond endless failures, was smell, explosions, stains, bottles that hissed when opened, manuscripts covered in ash and wine spills. The emperor lived among this chaos, slept in it, ate in it, stewed in it. His clothing was no better. Unlike other monarchs who at least pretended to change their garments regularly, Rudolf was known for wearing the same outfits for days on end. His robes were elaborately tailored and astronomically expensive, threaded with gold, velvet, and fur, but under the fine trimmings was a layer of sweat and body oil that only grew more permanent over time. Servants whispered that his sleeves sometimes stiffened at the elbows, that his collars bore sweat stains so thick they had to be scraped. He reportedly refused new shoes when his favourites still fit despite visible cracking, flattening, and the very real concern of foot rot. And then there were the bath habits, or, more accurately, the lack thereof. Rudolf was notoriously private. He loathed being touched, even by physicians. He rejected most medical procedures, refused to be shaved or cleaned by others, and avoided baths for long stretches, even when his skin began to crack or rash. When his mental health declined, and it did, spectacularly, he spent days locked in his chambers, refusing food, sleep, and basic hygiene. Servants were forced to leave meals at the door. When they finally entered, they found a sovereign who had soiled himself, reeking, surrounded by half-finished meals and spilled chemicals. One valet described the room as a place between a crypt and a kitchen. As the years dragged on, the emperor's physical condition matched the mental, bloated, damp, and sagging. His breath was sour, his hair thin and greasy. His skin, at times, blistered from exposure to alchemical agents. Physicians begged him to wash more frequently, to air out his chambers, to allow the castle maids to open the windows. He ignored them all. The stink, to Rudolf, was probably invisible, or worse part of the magic. He died in 1612, alone in his fortress of grime and grandeur. His body was embalmed in haste, likely to prevent the natural scent from becoming unnatural too quickly. His court, left behind, scrambled to restore order, burn the worst of the collection, and air out the imperial rooms. It took months. Rudolf's legacy is complicated. He was a patron of science, art, and mysticism. He helped usher in the scientific revolution and also the smell of rotting unicorn horns and wet vellum. His body may have decayed, but his court lived on in legend as the stinkiest brain trust in European history. But if Rudolf's madness created filth, the next monarch's body created it all by itself. Henry VIII didn't need alchemy to rot. He just needed time, ulcers, and a throne that came with both power and pus. Henry VIII of England, 1491–1547. At the height of his reign, Henry VIII was a vision of virility. Tall, broad-shouldered, and athletic. He jousted, danced, hunted, and married with thunderous energy. But by the end, bloated, infected, oozing, he became something closer to a cautionary tale in royal overindulgence. His personal hygiene didn't just decline, it collapsed under the sheer weight of his body, illness, and illusion. And the stench? It became a feature of the man, a scent that lingered behind his legend like the sour trail of meat gone wrong. In his youth, Henry had been fastidious. He wore fine silks, bathed regularly by Tudor standards, meaning maybe once a week, and prided himself on his grooming. His court was known for its elegance and ceremony, but time, injury, and ego did what soap could not prevent. They transformed the king into a living monument to rot. The decline began with a jousting accident in 1536. Henry, then already in his mid-40s and growing heavier by the year, took a brutal fall from his horse. His leg was crushed beneath him. The wound never healed. It reopened again and again, developing into a chronic ulcer that refused to close. Physicians tried every remedy in their arsenal, leeches, poultices, foul-smelling balms, but the leg only worsened. Infection set in, the skin blackened, pus oozed, and through it all, Henry refused amputation. So they bandaged it, daily, sometimes more. The wound leaked through linen wraps and into his stockings, soaking into the royal boots. The stench was described by contemporaries as sickening, nauseating, and offensive at a distance. Courtier accounts mention attendants struggling not to gag when removing his dressings. At one point, it was noted that the smell alone could clear a corridor before Henry arrived. But the ulcer wasn't the only problem. Henry's weight ballooned. By the end of his life, he was well over 300 pounds, an immense figure in an age without stretch fabric or blood pressure medication. He grew sedentary, rarely walking, let alone riding or dancing. His body creaked under its own mass. He developed bed sores, abdominal infections, and skin folds that were nearly impossible to clean properly. Servants assigned to help wash the king required instructions and, one assumes, iron stomachs. And his moods matched the stench. He became crueler, more paranoid, more erratic. His wives were discarded or beheaded. His ministers lived in fear. His physicians suffered his temper while trying to treat a body that increasingly resembled a rotting banquet. The royal bed linens changed constantly, still couldn't mask the smell. The rooms he slept in had to be aired out, incense burned, windows flung open despite the cold. His clothes didn't fare much better. Though he changed outfits, often dozens of lavish ensembles, gold-threaded and jeweled, they couldn't hide the reality beneath. Layers of velvet and ermine only insulated the stink. His undergarments, soaked in sweat, and the seepage from his leg, were reportedly destroyed after wear. Some attendants refused to touch them directly, using tongs or gloves to remove and launder the mess. Even his famously gilded diet played a part. Henry gorged on red meat, pies, custards and wine, consuming up to 5,000 calories a day without the benefit of exercise or moderation. His breath, by late life, was a horror foul, with indigestion, tooth decay, and rot from internal infections. He rarely smiled, and when he did, his teeth were black and jagged, his gums swollen and discolored. Still, he was the king. No one told him he stank. They bowed, flattered, and wept when he passed. But once the doors closed behind him, they lit candles and wiped down everything he'd touched. When Henry finally died in 1547, his body continued its grand decline. The bloating increased, the leg erupted. Embalmers struggled to contain the decomposition. There are accounts, possibly exaggerated, but widely repeated, of the corpse bursting in its coffin overnight, leaking foul fluids that stained the floor. His tomb bore the weight of empire. But the scent of his last days haunted the walls long after the kingdom passed to younger, cleaner hands. And yet, Henry's decay was sedentary. The next royal chose motion, constant battle, marching across Europe in the same stiff blue uniform, too busy conquering to wash. Charles XII of Sweden didn't rot in a palace. He ripened in the field. Charles XII of Sweden, 1682, 1718. If Henry VIII decayed in a palace, Charles XII of Sweden fermented on the battlefield. He was a soldier king in the most literal and stubborn sense, one who slept in tents, ate with his men, marched in the rain, and famously wore the same blue uniform for months on end. He didn't merely tolerate grime. He lived in it, breathed it, became it. Known as the Warrior King or Carolus Rex, Charles came to the throne at 15 and spent most of his adult life at war against Russia, Poland, Denmark, Saxony, Norway, and occasionally, good sense. His reign was defined by constant motion, forced marches, long sieges, and frostbitten campaigns through unrelenting terrain. Hygiene was not just a low priority, it was irrelevant. Bathing, to Charles, was as superfluous as diplomacy. He saw cleanliness as a distraction, a softness unfit for kings. And so, he didn't bathe. Or if he did, it was so rare that it slipped unnoticed into legend. Eyewitness accounts from the time remark not on his grooming habits, but on his lack of them. Soldiers wrote that the king wore the same stiff, salt-crusted, rain-soaked blue uniform through entire campaigns. The seams cracked, the wool stiffened, the cuffs yellowed with old sweat, but Charles refused to change. Why? Because vanity was weakness, comfort was indulgence. Charles prided himself on his stoicism, on enduring the same mud, cold, and filth as his troops. Unfortunately for everyone around him, this meant enduring the same odour, too. And oh, the smell. By the time the Great Northern War was in full swing, Charles was often described by foreign envoys as having a dense presence, not metaphysically, but olfactorily. His uniform reeked of gunpowder, horse sweat, and human grease. The lining, once soft, had hardened with accumulated dirt. Some of his officers joked that the coat could stand upright on its own. Others avoided standing downwind of him altogether. But he didn't care. He slept in his clothes, often on bare ground or on hay, and he rose with the sun stale, stiff, and unshaven. His hair, once golden and well kept in youth, grew lank and tangled under his weather-beaten tricorn. He had no patience for powder or pomade, no use for scented gloves or perfumed linen. In his mind, the cleanliness of a king was measured in victory, not fragrance. And yet, there was something theatrical in his filth. Charles's image, mud-streaked face, worn boots, rifle at his side, was cultivated. It was part of his legend, a weapon of morale. His men admired him. He shared their meals. He suffered their wounds. When others shivered, so did he. When they stank, so did their king, but always slightly worse, as if to outmatch their suffering. His stink was a kind of solidarity. He fought through snowstorms, marched with bullet wounds, and once rode for 14 hours straight with a shattered foot, all in the same clothes. His undergarments, rarely changed, became stiff with dried blood and sweat. His boots wore through and were patched repeatedly rather than replaced. According to one soldier, the king's socks, when finally removed, had to be burned. Another reported that Charles's bedding, what little he used, smelled like a barrack floor after a siege. And yet, his hygiene wasn't mocked. It was feared, revered. His enemies saw him as inhuman, a relentless, joyless machine of war. His appearance matched. Lean, pale, eyes sunken from sleep deprivation, and a scent that declared, "I have no time for soap. I'm here to conquer you." He died the way he lived on the battlefield, still in uniform, shot in the head during the siege of Frederickstein in 1718. Even in death, he wore that same blue coat, now darkened with blood and age. It was rumoured that his corpse smelled no worse than he had in life. And that was Charles XII, a man so allergic to comfort that even cleanliness had to die for his crown. He left behind no children, no heirs, and no fresh laundry. Thus ends our march through history's dirtiest monarchs, a parade of powder, pus, sweat, and stubbornness. 30 royals, 30 cautionary tales, 30 cents you'll never want bottled. Because power corrupts, but bad hygiene? That lingers.